Welcome back. Settle in, breathe slowly, and let your thoughts drift. Tonight, we gently step into the world of Minerva McGonagall. When we think of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, certain figures stand out as pillars of the institution itself. Professors who shaped not just the education of young witches and wizards, but the very character of the school. Among these legendary educators, one name rises above nearly all others: Minerva McGonagall, a witch of extraordinary power, unwavering principle, and fierce loyalty. A woman whose life spanned some of the most turbulent periods in wizarding history, who stood against darkness multiple times, who mentored generations of students, and who ultimately became one of the most respected figures in the entire magical world. Her story is one of duty and sacrifice, of love found and lost, of choosing what is right over what is easy, and of the quiet strength that comes from dedicating your life to protecting and educating others. To understand Minerva McGonagall is to understand what it truly means to be a Gryffindor, to be a teacher, and to be a guardian of all that is good in the wizarding world. Minerva McGonagall was born on October 4th, 1835, in the Highlands of Scotland. Her birthplace was a small Presbyterian village in Caithness, a remote and beautiful part of Scotland where the land meets the sea in dramatic fashion. The village was entirely non-magical, populated by muggles who had no idea that magic existed beyond their folk tales and legends. Into this ordinary muggle community, Minerva came into the world, the daughter of two people from completely different worlds who had fallen deeply in love, despite the complications that difference would bring. Her mother was Isabel Ross, a witch of considerable talent who had kept her magical nature hidden from her muggle neighbours for years. Isabel had grown up in the wizarding world, had attended Hogwarts herself, and had been sorted into Ravenclaw House. She was intelligent and practical, with a gift for household spells and charms that made everyday life easier. But Isabel had fallen in love with a muggle man, Robert McGonagall, the local minister, and a man of deep faith and gentle kindness. The marriage between a witch and a muggle was not forbidden, but it was complicated in ways that would affect their entire family. Robert McGonagall was a good man, respected in his community for his compassion and his dedication to his faith. He knew nothing of magic when he married Isabel. She kept her secret from him, as many witches and wizards did when they married muggles, fearing rejection or misunderstanding. This secret created a distance between them, a wall that Isabel maintained out of love and fear in equal measure. She wanted to tell him the truth, wanted to share her whole self with the man she loved. But the international statute of secrecy was clear, and the consequences of revealing magic to muggles could be severe. When Minerva was born, Isabel knew immediately that her daughter had inherited magical ability. The signs were subtle at first, but a witch who knew what to look for could see them. Objects moving when the baby cried, strange lights appearing in the nursery, the way Minerva's eyes seemed to follow things that weren't there, or rather, things that only magical people could sense. Isabel's heart both soared and sank at these signs. She was thrilled that her daughter would be part of the magical world, but she also knew this would make the secret she kept from her husband even harder to maintain. As Minerva grew into a toddler and then a young child, her magic became more obvious. She was an exceptionally bright child, walking and talking earlier than expected, showing a remarkable ability to focus and learn. But along with this intelligence came magical incidents that became increasingly difficult for Isabel to hide or explain away. Objects flew across rooms when Minerva was upset. She once turned her brother Malcolm's teddy bear a vivid shade of purple when he wouldn't share his toys with her. Another time, she made all the flowers in the garden bloom in the middle of winter because she wanted to see colours in the snow. Isabel worked tirelessly to cover up these magical occurrences, to make sure her husband and the rest of the village didn't see what was really happening. She used her own magic to clean up after Minerva's accidents, to reverse the effects of her daughter's uncontrolled power, to maintain the careful illusion that they were just an ordinary family. The strain of this constant vigilance wore on her, but she felt she had no choice. To reveal the truth meant risking everything: her marriage, her place in the community, possibly even custody of her children if Robert couldn't accept what they were. Minerva had 2 younger brothers, Malcolm and Robert Jr. The question of whether they would also be magical hung over the family like a shadow. As it turned out, neither boy showed any signs of magical ability. They were squibs, people born to magical parents, but without magic of their own. This created another layer of complexity in the McGonagall household. Minerva was clearly different from her brothers, and as she got older, she began to understand that difference more clearly. The relationship between Minerva and her brothers was complicated by this divide. Malcolm and Robert Jr. loved their sister, but they also sometimes resented her, sensing that she was special in ways they couldn't quite understand. Minerva, for her part, felt isolated even within her own family. She couldn't talk to her brothers about the strange things that happened around her, couldn't share the excitement she felt when she managed to make something happen with her mind. She loved them, but they lived in different worlds, even though they shared the same home. When Minerva was old enough to start asking questions about why she was different, why these strange things happened around her, Isabel knew she couldn't avoid the truth any longer. She told her daughter about magic, about the wizarding world, about Hogwarts school where Minerva would go when she turned 11. She explained that this had to be kept secret, especially from Minerva's father, who didn't know about magic and might not understand. Minerva was thrilled to learn about magic, to have a name for what she was and what she could do. But she was also confused and hurt that this had to be kept secret from her father, a man she loved and respected. Even at a young age, Minerva had a strong sense of right and wrong, and keeping such a huge secret from her father felt wrong to her. She asked her mother why they couldn't tell him, why he wouldn't understand. Isabel tried to explain about the statute of secrecy, about the long history of witches being persecuted, about how some muggles feared magic and magic users. But to young Minerva, it seemed like a failure of trust, a crack in the foundation of their family. This secret keeping would shape Minerva's understanding of love and duty for the rest of her life. She learned early that sometimes loving someone meant protecting them from truths they might not be able to handle. She learned that duty to the larger magical community sometimes had to come before personal happiness. And she learned that secrets, even necessary ones, could create distance between people who should be closest. As Minerva approached her 11th birthday, the wait for her Hogwarts letter became almost unbearable. Isabel had prepared her for what to expect, had told her stories about the castle and the classes and the magic she would learn. Minerva was desperate to go, to finally be in a place where she could be herself fully, where she wouldn't have to hide what she was or pretend to be ordinary. She counted down the days until October 4th, 1846, when she would turn 11 and become eligible for Hogwarts. The letter arrived exactly on schedule, delivered by a large tawny owl that swooped down to the McGonagall home in the early morning. Minerva was awake and waiting, watching the window for any sign of the bird her mother had told her to expect. When she saw the owl approaching, she ran outside before anyone else could wake up, grabbing the thick parchment envelope from the owl's leg. Her name was written in green ink in elegant script. Miss M. McGonagall, the second bedroom. McGonagall Residence, Caithness, Scotland. Inside was her acceptance letter to Hogwarts, along with a list of required books and supplies. Minerva read it 3 times in a row, memorizing every word, feeling a joy so intense it made her chest tight. This was real. She was really going to Hogwarts. She was really a witch, officially recognized by the wizarding world. Isabel smiled when she saw her daughter's excitement, remembering her own first letter, her own first trip to the castle. But there was sadness there too, knowing that this would mean more secrets, more distance between her husband and her daughter. The question of how to explain Minerva's departure to Robert McGonagall was solved with a story about a special boarding school in the Highlands, a school for gifted children where Minerva could receive an education that the local village school couldn't provide. Robert was hesitant to send his daughter away, but he could see how bright she was, how much she needed challenges beyond what their small village could offer. He agreed, though it pained him to think of his little girl leaving home. Shopping for school supplies in Diagon Alley was Minerva's first real exposure to the wizarding world beyond her mother's stories. She stood in the crowded street, turning in slow circles to take it all in. Shops selling cauldrons and telescopes, robes and wands, books that moved on their shelves, and creatures that chattered in cages. Witches and wizards walked past in colourful robes, some floating slightly above the ground, others accompanied by cats or owls or toads. It was overwhelming and wonderful, and exactly what Minerva had dreamed it would be. The most important stop was Ollivander's, the wand shop where every witch and wizard found the wand that would choose them. Minerva entered the narrow, dimly lit shop with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. Mr. Ollivander, an elderly wizard with unsettling silver eyes, studied her for a long moment before disappearing into the shelves of wand boxes that lined the walls from floor to ceiling. He returned with several boxes, opening them one by one, and handing Minerva each wand to try. The first few wands did nothing when she held them. One sparked and then went dark. Another actually flew out of her hand and clattered across the floor. But then Mr. Ollivander handed her a longer wand made of fir wood with a dragon heartstring core, 9.5 inches, quite firm. The moment Minerva's fingers closed around it, she felt warmth spread up her arm, and red and gold sparks shot from the wand tip. This was her wand, the one that had chosen her. Mr. Ollivander nodded with satisfaction, saying something about firwood being particularly suited to those who were resilient and focused, who would never give up on a righteous cause. Minerva didn't fully understand what he meant at the time, but she would remember those words throughout her life. September 1st, 1846, arrived with a mixture of excitement and anxiety. Isabel took Minerva to King's Cross Station in London, to the secret platform 9 3/4 that existed between platforms 9 and 10. Minerva was nervous about running at the barrier, but her mother assured her it would work. They ran together, Minerva pushing her trolley with her trunk and her new cat, a small tabby she had named Sebastian. The solid barrier melted away, and suddenly they were on a different platform entirely, where the Scarlet Hogwarts Express waited with steam pouring from its engine. The platform was crowded with students and parents saying goodbye. Older students greeted friends they hadn't seen all summer. First years looked around with wide eyes, clutching their parents' hands or trying to look braver than they felt. Minerva hugged her mother tightly, suddenly unsure if she wanted to leave after all. But Isabel smiled and told her to be brave, to learn everything she could, to make the most of this incredible opportunity. Then she gently pushed Minerva toward the train. Finding an empty compartment was challenging, as most were already full of chattering students. Minerva finally found one with only 2 other first years, both looking as nervous as she felt. They introduced themselves as Elizabeth Blackwood and Margaret Armstrong, both from wizarding families. The 3 girls talked hesitantly at first, then with growing excitement as the train pulled away from the platform and began its journey north to Scotland. The journey to Hogwarts took most of the day. The train travelled through the English countryside, past cities and villages, and eventually into wilder, more remote areas. Minerva pressed her face to the window, watching the landscape change, feeling like she was travelling to another world entirely. The lady with the food trolley came by, and Minerva bought her first chocolate frogs, and Bertie Bott's every flavour beans, marvelling at treats that moved and changed and sometimes tasted absolutely disgusting. As evening approached and the sky darkened, older students began changing into their school robes. Minerva and the other first years followed suit, pulling on the plain black robes that marked them as students who didn't yet belong to any house. The anticipation grew almost unbearable as the train finally began to slow, pulling into Hogsmeade Station in the darkness. Through the windows, Minerva could see lamps lighting the platform and hear a booming voice calling out, "First years! First years! Over here!" The man calling for first years was enormous, at least twice as tall as a normal man and nearly as wide. He had a wild tangle of black hair and beard and small black eyes that twinkled kindly. He introduced himself as Og, the groundskeeper and gamekeeper at Hogwarts. He led the first years down a steep, narrow path through dark trees, warning them to watch their step. Then they came around a bend, and there it was, Hogwarts Castle. The castle rose up on the far side of a great black lake, its many windows glowing with warm light, towers and turrets reaching up into the starry sky. It was the most beautiful and impressive thing Minerva had ever seen. All the first years stopped and stared, even those who had grown up hearing about Hogwarts, even those whose parents and siblings had attended before them. There was something magical about that first glimpse of the castle, something that took your breath away no matter how prepared you thought you were. They crossed the lake in small boats, 4 students to each boat, which moved across the water by magic without anyone rowing. Minerva sat very still, afraid to move and disturb the boat's magic, watching the castle grow larger as they approached. They entered through a cave-like opening and climbed out onto a rocky shore, then up a flight of stone steps to a massive oak door. Og knocked 3 times and the door swung open. A tall, stern-looking witch stood in the entrance hall. She introduced herself as Professor Alecto Graves, the deputy headmistress and head of Gryffindor House. She explained what would happen next. They would enter the great hall where all the older students and teachers were waiting. They would be sorted into their houses by the sorting hat, an ancient magical hat that could look into their minds and see what qualities they possessed, where they would fit best. The 4 houses were Gryffindor, Hufflepuff, Ravenclaw, and Slytherin. Each house had its own history, its own common room and dormitories, its own characteristics that it valued. Professor Graves led them through a side door to wait while she checked that everything was ready. The first years clustered together nervously, whispering to each other about the sorting. Some claimed to know secret tests they would have to pass. Others worried about being sent home if the hat couldn't find a house for them. Minerva stood quietly, trying to calm her racing heart, wondering which house would claim her. Then Professor Graves returned and led them into the great hall. The room was breathtaking. 4 long tables ran the length of the hall, each filled with students in black robes trimmed with different colors. Thousands of candles floated in midair, casting golden light over everything. The ceiling was enchanted to look like the sky outside, showing clouds drifting past stars. At the front of the hall, the teachers sat at a raised table, watching as the first years filed in. In the center of the room, in front of the teacher's table, sat a three-legged stool with an ancient, patched wizard's hat resting on it. The hat looked ordinary at first, just an old pointed hat that had seen better days. But then it stirred, a tear near the brim opened like a mouth, and the hat began to sing. Its song explained the four houses and what each valued. Gryffindor prized bravery and courage. Hufflepuff valued loyalty and hard work. Ravenclaw sought intelligence and creativity. Slytherin wanted ambition and cunning. When the song ended, Professor Graves began calling names in alphabetical order. Each student walked forward, sat on the stool, and had the hat placed on their head. Sometimes the hat decided immediately, calling out a house name after only a moment. Other times, it deliberated longer, seeming to have a conversation with the student that no one else could hear. Minerva watched as Elizabeth Blackwood became a Ravenclaw, and Margaret Armstrong joined Hufflepuff. She watched students go to each house, saw the tables cheer as new members were added. Then she heard her name. McGonagall, Minerva. Minerva walked forward on shaking legs, very aware that hundreds of eyes were watching her. She sat on the stool, and Professor Graves lowered the sorting hat onto her head. It was too large and slipped down over her eyes, blocking out the great hall. Then she heard a small voice speaking in her ear, though she knew no one else could hear it. The hat spoke to her about what it saw in her mind. She had a brilliant mind, sharp and focused, perfect for Ravenclaw. She had a capacity for hard work and loyalty that Hufflepuff would value. But above all, the hat saw courage. Not the loud, brash courage of someone who charged into danger without thinking, but the steady, determined courage of someone who would do what was right, no matter how difficult or frightening it was. She had a strong sense of justice, a need to protect others, a willingness to stand up against wrong, even when standing alone. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably less than a minute, the hat made its decision. It shouted out loud enough for the whole hall to hear, "Gryffindor." The table on the far left exploded with applause and cheers. Minerva pulled off the hat with trembling hands, handed it to Professor Graves, and walked toward the Gryffindor table in a daze. Students moved aside to make room for her, patting her on the back, welcoming her to the house. She sat down, her heart still racing, and looked up at the teacher's table. An older wizard with a long silver beard and half-moon spectacles smiled at her and nodded slightly. She would later learn this was Headmaster Armando Dippet, who had led Hogwarts for decades. The rest of the sorting continued, but Minerva barely noticed, still processing that she was a Gryffindor, still adjusting to this new identity. When the last first year had been sorted, Headmaster Dippet stood and gave a brief welcome speech. He mentioned a few rules, including that the Forbidden Forest was off-limits to all students, and that magic should not be used in the corridors between classes. Then he clapped his hands, and the empty golden plates in front of every student suddenly filled with food. The feast was unlike anything Minerva had experienced. Roasted meats and boiled potatoes, Yorkshire puddings and vegetables, pies and stews and fresh bread. Everything was delicious, and there seemed to be an endless supply. The older Gryffindors talked to the first years, asking about their journeys to Hogwarts, telling them about classes and teachers and secret passages. The Gryffindor prefects, older students with special badges, explained house points and how you could earn them through good work or lose them through rule breaking. After the feast came desserts, more varieties than Minerva could count. Ice cream and cakes, pies and pastries, puddings and fruit. She ate until she couldn't manage another bite, feeling sleepy and content. Finally, Headmaster Dippet stood again and dismissed the students to their dormitories. The Gryffindor prefects led the first years out of the Great Hall, through corridors and up moving staircases that changed position while you were on them. The Gryffindor common room was located in one of the towers, behind a portrait of a fat lady in a pink silk dress. The prefects explained that you needed to give her the correct password to enter. The password changed regularly and would be posted in the common room when it changed. The current password was Fortis Fortuna Adiuvat, which meant fortune favours the bold in Latin. The common room was warm and comfortable, decorated in scarlet and gold. Comfortable armchairs and sofas were arranged around a large fireplace. Tables for studying filled the corners. The walls were lined with windows that showed the night sky, though it was too dark to see much outside. The dormitories for boys and girls were reached by separate staircases on opposite sides of the room. Minerva followed the other first-year girls up the spiral staircase to their dormitory. The room held 5 four-poster beds, each hung with scarlet and gold curtains. Her trunk was already there, sitting at the foot of the bed, with her name on it, and Sebastian's cage sat on the nightstand. The other girls introduced themselves as they unpacked. Besides Elizabeth, whom Minerva had met on the train, and who had been sorted into Ravenclaw, there was Rosalind Murray, Patricia Roll, Emmeline Capper, and Diana Mortimer. As Minerva lay in bed that first night, the curtains drawn around her for privacy, she felt a mixture of emotions washing over her. Excitement about the magic she would learn, nervousness about the classes she would take, happiness at being part of Gryffindor House, and an aching homesickness for her family and the village she had left behind. She could hear the other girls settling into their beds, whispering to each other in the darkness. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and Minerva fell asleep, dreaming of moving staircases and talking hats and the magical education that awaited her in the morning. Her first day of classes began early, with Minerva waking before dawn from sheer excitement. She dressed carefully in her new school robes, making sure everything was perfect, then headed down to the common room. A few older students were already there, studying or talking quietly. Minerva sat by the fire with one of her textbooks, reading about basic wand movements until her fellow first years appeared, and they all headed down to breakfast together. The great hall looked different in the morning light streaming through the high windows. Students filled the tables, eating and talking, and looking at their schedules for the day. The enchanted ceiling showed a pale blue sky with wisps of white cloud. Minerva found a seat at the Gryffindor table and received her class schedule from Professor Graves, who was walking along the table, distributing them to all the first years. Minerva's schedule was full. Transfiguration, charms, potions, herbology, defense against the dark arts, history of magic, and astronomy. Each class met multiple times per week, and the students had to navigate the enormous castle to get from one classroom to another. Minerva studied her schedule carefully, already planning the routes she would need to take between classes, memorizing which floors different classrooms were on. Her first class was Transfiguration, taught by Professor Herbert Beery. Transfiguration was the branch of magic that dealt with changing objects from one thing into another, altering their form or properties. Professor Beery explained that Transfiguration was some of the most complex magic they would learn at Hogwarts, requiring exceptional concentration and precise wand movements. They would start with simple transformations and work their way up to more difficult ones over their years at school. Minerva discovered immediately that she had a natural talent for transfiguration. While other students struggled to turn their matches into needles in that first lesson, Minerva succeeded on her third attempt. Professor Beery praised her focus and her wand control, awarding Gryffindor 5 house points. Minerva felt a warm glow of pride, but she was also careful not to boast to her classmates. She had already learned that showing off magical talent could create resentment, especially among those who were struggling. Charms class with Professor Flitwick came next. Professor Flitwick was a very short wizard who had to stand on a stack of books to see over his desk. He was enthusiastic and energetic, always encouraging even when spells went wrong. Charms dealt with giving objects new properties or making them do things they couldn't do naturally. Their first lesson covered the levitation charm, which would make objects float in the air. This proved more difficult than transfiguration for most students. Minerva managed to make her feather wobble and lift slightly off the desk, but it took intense concentration, and she felt exhausted afterward. Potions was held in the dungeons, in a cold stone classroom lined with shelves of jarred ingredients. The potions master was Professor Sylvanus Kettleburn, a wizard missing several fingers and part of one arm from various potion accidents over the years. He was strict and demanded perfect precision in measuring and stirring. Potions, he explained, was both an art and a science. You had to follow instructions exactly, while also understanding the properties of each ingredient and how they interacted. One mistake could turn a healing potion into a poison. Minerva found potions challenging, but fascinating. She liked the methodical nature of it, the way you had to be careful and precise. She also liked that potions didn't rely entirely on wand magic. Squibs and even muggles could theoretically brew certain potions if they had the ingredients and the instructions, though they wouldn't be able to perform some of the more advanced stirring charms or handle ingredients that required magical touch. Thinking about this made her think of her brothers, and she felt a pang of sadness that they would never experience any of this. The weeks passed quickly as Minerva settled into the rhythm of school life. Wake up, go to classes, study in the library or common room, eat meals in the Great Hall, attend more classes, do homework until late at night. It was exhausting and demanding and absolutely wonderful. Minerva threw herself into her studies with an intensity that impressed even the older students. She arrived early to every class, sat in the front row, asked questions when she didn't understand something, and spent hours in the library researching topics beyond what was covered in lessons. Her hard work paid off quickly. She excelled in transfiguration, regularly producing transformations that were more complete and more stable than anyone else in her year. She mastered the levitation charm and moved on to more complex charms, while others were still struggling with the basics. Her potions were consistently among the best in the class, carefully brewed with precise measurements and perfect timing. Even in subjects that didn't come as naturally, like history of magic, which was often boring, she forced herself to pay attention and memorize the important dates and events. But Minerva's excellence came at a social cost. Some of her housemates began to resent her for always knowing the answers, for always earning house points, for making everyone else look bad by comparison. They called her a know-it-all behind her back, said she was trying too hard to impress the teachers. Minerva overheard these comments, and they hurt, but she refused to dumb herself down or pretend to be less capable than she was. She was at Hogwarts to learn, to become the best witch she could be, and she wasn't going to apologize for that. She did make friends, though not many. Rosalind Murray, one of her dormitory mates, appreciated Minerva's intelligence and work ethic. The two of them studied together often, pushing each other to understand difficult concepts. There was also a boy in Ravenclaw named Malcolm Rowley, who shared Minerva's love of Transfiguration. They became friendly rivals, each trying to outdo the other in class, though always respectfully and with mutual admiration. As first year progressed, Minerva discovered something interesting about herself. She had strong opinions about right and wrong, and she wasn't afraid to voice them even when it made her unpopular. When she saw older students bullying younger ones, she spoke up. When she witnessed someone cheating on an essay, she reported it to a prefect. When friends suggested breaking rules for fun, she refused to participate and tried to talk them out of it. This earned her a reputation as uptight and overly serious, a teacher's pet who couldn't relax and have fun. But Minerva didn't see it that way. She understood that rules existed for reasons, that they helped maintain order and safety in a castle full of young people learning dangerous magic. She saw the consequences when rules were broken, when spells went wrong, when students were injured because they were doing things they shouldn't. She had no patience for recklessness or for people who thought rules didn't apply to them. This aspect of her personality would only strengthen as she got older, eventually becoming one of her defining characteristics. The end of first year brought exams, both written and practical. Minerva prepared intensively, reviewing all her notes, practicing every spell they had learned, memorizing potion recipes and wand movements. The exams were challenging, but she felt confident she had done well. When the results were posted, Minerva had achieved top marks in every subject except History of Magic, where she came second. She was thrilled, but tried not to show it too much, knowing it would further isolate her from classmates who hadn't done as well. The year ended with the House Cup ceremony in the Great Hall. Points were tallied from the 4 hourglasses that tracked each house's score. Gryffindor came in second place, narrowly beaten by Ravenclaw. Minerva felt a flash of disappointment, wishing she had earned enough points to secure victory for her house. She resolved to do even better next year, to push Gryffindor to the top. Summer back in Caithness was strange after a year at Hogwarts. Everything seemed smaller and duller. The magic she had learned was useless outside of school, as underage wizards weren't allowed to perform magic during the summer holidays. The decree for the reasonable restriction of underage sorcery prohibited anyone under 17 from using magic outside of school, with limited exceptions. Minerva chafed under this restriction, wanting to practice the spells she had learned, wanting to experiment with new ideas. Her relationship with her father remained complicated by the secret of her magical nature. Robert McGonagall asked about her school year, and Minerva told him carefully edited versions of the truth. She talked about her classes without mentioning they were magic classes, about her friends without explaining they were witches and wizards, about the castle without describing the moving staircases or talking portraits. It felt dishonest, and Minerva hated it, but she had no choice. Her brothers Malcolm and Robert Jr. were growing older as well, now 8 and 6 years old respectively. They were jealous of Minerva being away at boarding school, feeling left behind in the small village. Minerva felt guilty about the divide between them, but didn't know how to bridge it. They were muggles, or at least non-magical. They would never understand the world she now belonged to. The distance between them was only going to grow as Minerva spent more time at Hogwarts and less time at home. Second year at Hogwarts brought new subjects and new challenges. Minerva continued to excel in all her classes, particularly Transfiguration, where Professor Beery had her demonstrating spells for the class. She also discovered a talent for defense against the dark arts. the subject that taught students how to protect themselves against dark creatures and dark magic. The defense teacher, Professor Merrythought, noticed Minerva's quick reflexes and sharp thinking, both valuable traits for defensive magic. It was also in second year that Minerva first heard about Animagi. An Animagus was a witch or wizard who could transform themselves into an animal at will. It was extremely advanced magic that required years of practice and had to be registered with the Ministry of Magic. Professor Beery mentioned it briefly while teaching them about human transfiguration, which was banned for students to attempt. The idea fascinated Minerva. To be able to transform into an animal, to see the world from a completely different perspective, it seemed like the ultimate expression of transfiguration skill. She asked Professor Beery about it after class, wanting to know more details. He explained that the process of becoming an animagus was difficult and dangerous. It involved weeks of preparation, holding a mandrake leaf in your mouth for an entire month, brewing a complex potion, and then performing the transformation during a lightning storm. Many witches and wizards who attempted the process failed, and failure could result in partial transformation that left you stuck between human and animal forms. Even successful animagi sometimes found their animal form was something disappointing or useless. Professor Beery strongly discouraged students from attempting it, saying it was magic that should only be undertaken by fully trained adult witches and wizards under proper supervision. But the seed was planted in Minerva's mind. She filed the information away for future reference, knowing it would be years before she could even consider attempting such advanced magic. Still, the idea of becoming an animagus stayed with her, appearing in her thoughts during transfiguration lessons, influencing the kinds of questions she asked and the additional reading she did in the library. Third year brought even more subjects to study. Students could now choose elective courses in addition to their core classes. Minerva signed up for everything offered: arithmancy, study of ancient runes, care of magical creatures, and Muggle studies. Her timetable became impossibly full, with classes running from early morning until late evening, and homework that kept her up past midnight most nights. Her housemates thought she was crazy for taking on so much, but Minerva loved it. She loved learning new things, loved challenging herself, loved the feeling of her mind expanding as she absorbed new information and mastered new skills. Arithmancy dealt with the magical properties of numbers and how they could be used for divination and spell creation. It was highly complex, involving calculations and formulas that many students found dry and boring. Minerva found it fascinating, appreciating the logical structure and the way everything built on previous knowledge. Ancient runes taught them to read and translate ancient magical texts written in runic alphabets. This opened up entire libraries of knowledge that weren't available in modern translations, allowing access to spells and magical theory from centuries past. Care of magical creatures was taught by Professor Sylvanus Kettleburn, who also taught potions and was famously reckless with dangerous creatures. Despite his missing fingers and other injuries, he remained enthusiastic about even the most dangerous magical beasts. Classes involved hands-on interaction with creatures ranging from relatively harmless like flobberworms and nifflers to potentially deadly like hippogriffs and acromantulas. Minerva appreciated the knowledge, but found herself frequently concerned about Professor Kettleburn's safety practices, or lack thereof. Muggle studies was taught by Professor Concordia Roll, a witch who had never actually lived among Muggles, but had studied them extensively. The class covered Muggle culture, technology, and society, with the stated goal of helping young witches and wizards understand non-magical people better. For Minerva, who had grown up in a Muggle village with a Muggle father, much of the material was already familiar. but she found it interesting to see how the magical world misunderstood muggles, how many wizards believed things about non-magical people that simply weren't true. Professor Rowell taught that muggles were primitive and helpless without magic, incapable of achieving anything truly impressive. She described muggle technology with disdain, as crude attempts to replicate what magic could do easily. Minerva found herself disagreeing with much of this characterization. Her father was a muggle, and he was neither primitive nor helpless. He was intelligent and capable, running his church community with wisdom and compassion. The muggles in her village managed their lives perfectly well without magic, using tools and knowledge instead of spells. But Minerva kept these thoughts mostly to herself. She didn't want to reveal too much about her own background, didn't want to explain that she had a muggle father and squib brothers. The wizarding world, she had learned, had complicated views about blood purity and magical lineage. While Gryffindor House was generally more accepting than some others, particularly Slytherin, where pure-blood supremacy was common, there were still students who looked down on half-bloods and muggle-borns. Minerva didn't want to deal with that kind of prejudice, so she kept her family situation private. As the years progressed, Minerva's reputation as the most talented student in her year became firmly established. She earned outstanding grades in every subject, collected more house points than any other single student, and was frequently held up by teachers as an example of how students should approach their studies. By 5th year, she was already performing magic that 7th years struggled with, particularly in Transfiguration, where her skill had surpassed most of her professors' expectations. 5th year also brought the dreaded Ordinary Wizarding Level Examinations, or OWLs. These were standardized tests administered by the Wizarding Examinations Authority that determined which subjects students could continue studying at any WT level in their final 2 years. Students needed to achieve at least an acceptable grade to continue with a subject, though most professors required an exceeds expectations or outstanding to admit students to any WT classes. Minerva prepared for her OWLs with characteristic intensity. She created detailed study schedules, organized study groups for her classmates, and spent entire weekends in the library reviewing 5 years of material in each subject. Her dormitory mates complained that she was making them all look bad, that she was setting an impossible standard. Minerva ignored them. These exams were important, would determine her future options, and she intended to do her absolute best. The OWL examinations lasted 2 weeks, with both written and practical components for each subject. Minerva sat through hours of written exams, filling parchment after parchment with detailed answers about potion ingredients, spell theory, historical events, and magical creatures. The practical exams required her to demonstrate spells and transformations, while examiners watched and graded her performance. She transfigured a desk into a pig and back again without error. She brewed a complex potion under time pressure without a single mistake. She identified and countered a series of dark magic curses in the defense practical. When the results arrived by Owl that summer, Minerva had achieved the highest OWL scores in Hogwarts history up to that point. She earned outstanding grades in every single subject she had taken, with perfect scores on most of the practical examinations. The letter from the Wizarding Examinations Authority included a note of congratulations from the head examiner, praising her exceptional abilities and suggesting she consider a career in magical education or advanced magical research. Minerva's parents were proud, though her father didn't fully understand what the scores meant since she had to explain them in non-magical terms. Isabel knew exactly what her daughter had achieved and hugged her tightly, tears in her eyes. She had never imagined her daughter would be this gifted, would excel to such a degree. Malcolm and Robert Jr. were less impressed, feeling even more left out as their sister achieved things they couldn't understand in a world they couldn't access. Sixth year began with students selecting which NEWT subjects they would study for their final 2 years at Hogwarts. Most students chose 4 or 5 subjects to focus on, dropping the ones they had struggled with or weren't interested in pursuing. Minerva, predictably, decided to continue with every subject she had taken OWLs in. Her professors tried to talk her out of this, explaining that the NJWT workload was significantly heavier than OWLs, and that studying too many subjects would be overwhelming. Minerva politely but firmly insisted she could handle it. NEWT classes were smaller, more focused, and significantly more difficult than anything Minerva had encountered before. The work was genuinely challenging even for her, requiring hours of study and practice for each subject. She spent most of her waking hours either in class, in the library, or in empty classrooms practicing spells and transformations. Her social life was virtually non-existent. She had few close friends, mostly because she had little time for socializing, and because her academic intensity intimidated many of her peers. But sixth year also brought something Minerva hadn't expected, her first real romance. His name was Dougal McGregor, and he wasn't a wizard. He was a muggle boy from a neighbouring village whom Minerva met during the Christmas holiday when she returned home to Caithness. Dougal was handsome and charming, with dark hair and bright eyes that seemed to see right through Minerva's serious exterior to the young woman underneath. He worked as an apprentice to his father, who ran a farm just outside Minerva's village. They met by chance when Minerva was walking along the coastal cliffs, something she did to clear her mind during the holiday break. Dougal was checking on sheep that had wandered near the cliff edge, and they struck up a conversation. He was easy to talk to, funny and kind, and he treated Minerva like a normal girl instead of like the intimidating know-it-all her classmates saw. He didn't know about magic, didn't know about Hogwarts or OWLs or any of it. To him, she was just Minerva, the minister's daughter who had been away at boarding school. They began meeting regularly during that holiday break, taking long walks along the cliffs, talking about their dreams and hopes for the future. Dougal wanted to take over his father's farm eventually, to build it into something more successful than it currently was. He talked about modernizing the farming methods, about introducing new crops, about building a life in Scotland that was connected to the land. Minerva found herself drawn to his simple ambition, to the straightforward way he saw his future. But she also felt the weight of the secret she was keeping. Dougal didn't know she was a witch. He thought she went to a normal boarding school, that she studied normal subjects. Every time he asked about her school life, Minerva had to lie or redirect the conversation. It felt wrong, dishonest in a way that made her uncomfortable. She thought about her mother keeping the same secret from her father, about how that secret had created distance in their marriage. She didn't want that for herself. When the holiday ended and Minerva had to return to Hogwarts, Dougal asked if he could write to her. Minerva hesitated, knowing that exchanging letters would be complicated. Owl post would be difficult to explain. She couldn't tell him the truth about where she was or what she was learning. But she liked him more than she had liked anyone before, and she couldn't bring herself to say no. She told him yes, they could write, and gave him the address of the post office in Hogsmeade Village, where she could arrange to pick up Muggle mail. The correspondence that followed over the next year and a half was both wonderful and painful. Dougal's letters were full of news from home, stories about his work on the farm, questions about her studies and her life at school. Minerva's replies were carefully crafted to avoid revealing anything about magic while still being honest about her feelings and her experiences in the ways she could share them. She told him about her studies in transformation and defense without mentioning they were magical subjects. She described the castle and the grounds without mentioning the enchantments and magical creatures. It was exhausting maintaining this elaborate fiction, but she couldn't stop. By the middle of 7th year, their relationship had deepened through their letters. Dougal wrote that he loved her, that he wanted to marry her when she finished school, that he had already spoken to his father about building a small house on the edge of the farm property where they could live. Minerva read this letter in the Gryffindor common room and felt her heart breaking. She wanted to say yes. She wanted the simple, normal life that Dougal was offering. Marriage, a home, a life connected to the land and the community she had grown up in. But she was a witch. She had magic that she would never be able to use if she married Dougal and lived as a muggle. She had abilities and knowledge that she would have to hide forever, just as her mother had hidden her magic from her father. And Minerva had seen firsthand how that secret keeping poisoned relationships, how it created distance and dishonesty that could never be fully overcome. There was also the question of her career ambitions. Minerva had known for years that she wanted to work in the magical world, that she wanted to use her talents and her education to make a difference. Several of her professors had encouraged her to consider teaching, saying she had a gift for explaining complex concepts and that she understood magic at a level that would make her an excellent educator. The Ministry of Magic had also expressed interest in recruiting her, particularly for the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, where her skills and her strong sense of justice would be valuable. If she married Dougal and lived as a muggle, all of that would be impossible. She would have to give up the magical world entirely, or at least reduce her involvement to the point where it wouldn't be noticed. She would have to pretend to be something she wasn't, would have to hide the most fundamental part of herself from the person who was supposed to be closest to her. Her mother had managed it, but Minerva had seen the cost. She didn't want to pay that price, but she also didn't want to hurt Dougal, who had done nothing wrong except fall in love with a girl who couldn't give him what he wanted. For weeks, Minerva agonized over what to do. She talked to no one about it, keeping the whole situation private. She considered talking to her mother, but didn't want to hear that it was possible to make it work, because she knew in her heart that she didn't want to make it work. She wanted her magic. She wanted her career. She wanted to be part of the wizarding world without having to hide or compromise. Finally, in May of her 7th year, Minerva made her decision. She wrote to Dougal and told him the truth, not about magic, but about her intentions. She told him that she had been offered a position after graduation that would require her to travel extensively, to be away from Scotland for long periods, to dedicate herself fully to her career. She told him that she cared for him deeply, but that she couldn't marry him, couldn't give him the life he wanted and deserved. She told him he should forget about her and find someone else, someone who could be a proper wife and give him the simple life he dreamed of. It was one of the hardest letters Minerva had ever written. She cried while writing it, knowing she was breaking both their hearts, but also knowing it was the right choice. When she sent the letter off with the Muggle post, she felt a sense of relief mixed with deep sadness. She had chosen magic over love, career over family, her own ambitions over someone else's dreams. It felt selfish, but it also felt true to who she was and what she wanted from life. Dougal's response came 2 weeks later. He was hurt and confused, didn't understand why Minerva was willing to throw away what they had for a job. He asked her to reconsider, to think about what she was giving up. But he also said that if this was truly what she wanted, he wouldn't stand in her way. He wished her well and asked her not to write again, as it would be too painful to maintain contact. Minerva respected his wishes, though she kept all his letters in a box at the bottom of her trunk, unable to throw them away, even though she knew she should. The rest of 7th year passed in a blur of naughty preparation and grief over the future she had given up. Minerva threw herself into her studies with even more intensity than before, using work to avoid thinking about Dougal and the choice she had made. She spent almost every waking hour studying, reviewing 7 years of magical education, practicing every spell and transformation she had ever learned. The new T examinations were even more rigorous than the OWLs had been. They were designed to test not just knowledge, but deep understanding, creativity, and the ability to apply magic in novel situations. Minerva sat through days of written examinations, producing essays that demonstrated mastery of magical theory. The practical exams were challenging and sometimes dangerous, requiring her to perform advanced magic under pressure, while examiners evaluated every wand movement and word of her incantations. Her Transfiguration practical was particularly memorable. The examiners asked her to perform a series of transformations, starting simple and becoming progressively more difficult. She transfigured a mouse into a snuff box and back again. She transformed a desk into a pig, changed its color, made it larger, then returned it to desk form without any errors. Finally, the head examiner asked if she had studied Animagus transformation. When Minerva said she had researched it extensively, but hadn't attempted the actual process, the examiner asked her to explain in detail how one became an Animagus, what the risks were, and what the legal requirements involved. Minerva's answer was comprehensive and detailed, covering everything from the month-long preparation phase to the final transformation during a lightning storm, from the potential for partial transformation to the requirement to register with the ministry's Animagus registry. The examiner seemed impressed, making notes and nodding throughout her explanation. When she finished, he told her that her understanding of advanced transfiguration theory was among the best he had ever encountered in a student. When the Nevoti results arrived that summer, Minerva had once again achieved perfect scores, outstanding grades in every subject, with special commendations from several examiners noting her exceptional abilities. She had set a new record for NWT scores, surpassing even her own OWL performance. The letter from the Wizarding Examinations Authority included multiple job offers from various departments within the Ministry of Magic, all eager to recruit such a talented young witch. Minerva considered the offers carefully. The Department of Magical Law Enforcement wanted her for their Aura training program, the elite force of dark wizard catchers who protected the wizarding world from dangerous criminals. The Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes offered her a position helping to clean up after magical mishaps and obliviating muggles who witnessed magic. The Department of International Magical Cooperation wanted her for their team that worked with foreign magical governments. Even the Department of Mysteries, the secretive research division, extended a tentative offer pending interviews. In the end, Minerva chose the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, though not as an Aura. Instead, she joined a relatively new division focused on ensuring proper application of wizarding laws, particularly those related to Muggle relations and the International Statute of Secrecy. It was a position that combined her strong sense of justice with her unique perspective as someone who had grown up in both the magical and Muggle worlds. She started work in September of 1854, moving to London and beginning her career in the ministry. Her work at the ministry was important but often frustrating. Minerva quickly discovered that the wizarding government was riddled with inefficiency, prejudice, and resistance to change. Many of her colleagues looked down on Muggles, viewing non-magical people as inferior beings to be managed and controlled rather than respected. The laws she was supposed to enforce often seemed designed more to maintain wizarding secrecy than to ensure fair treatment of Muggles or protect them from magical harm. One of her early cases involved a wizard who had been using magic to sabotage a Muggle competitor's business. The wizard argued that Muggles weren't entitled to the same protections as magical people, that using magic for personal advantage over non-magical people wasn't really a crime, since Muggles were inherently inferior anyway. Minerva was appalled by this reasoning and worked tirelessly to build a case that resulted in the wizard's prosecution. But the sentence was light, barely more than a slap on the wrist, and Minerva realized that the wizarding justice system didn't take crimes against Muggles as seriously as crimes against other magical people. Another case involved a witch who had married a Muggle without telling him about magic, similar to Minerva's own mother's situation. When the witch's magic was eventually revealed through an accident, the Muggle husband had been terrified and had wanted to end the marriage. The witch had used a memory charm to make him forget, to essentially reset their relationship too before he knew. Minerva was assigned to investigate whether this violated laws about improper use of magic on Muggles. The case hit uncomfortably close to home, making her think about her mother and father, about Dougal and the secrets she had kept from him. Minerva argued that the memory charm was a violation of the Muggle's autonomy, that he had a right to know the truth about his own wife, even if that truth was dangerous from a statute of secrecy perspective. Her superiors disagreed, ruling that maintaining the statute was more important than one Muggle's right to know about magic. The witch was given a warning, but faced no real consequences. The Muggle husband would never know that his memories had been altered, that his wife had taken away his ability to make an informed choice about their marriage. After 2 years at the ministry, Minerva had become thoroughly disillusioned with the bureaucracy and the prejudice that seemed baked into the system. She was good at her job, had earned promotions and respect from her colleagues, but she no longer felt like she was making a real difference. The laws she enforced seemed designed to maintain the status quo rather than to promote justice. The attitudes of most ministry workers toward Muggles ranged from condescending to outright hostile. And there was no sign that anything would change in the near future. It was during this time of professional dissatisfaction that Minerva received a letter that would change the course of her life. The letter was from Armando Dippet, still the headmaster of Hogwarts after decades in the position. He wrote that Professor Herbert Beery, who had taught Minerva Transfiguration during her own school years, was planning to retire at the end of the current school year. Dippet was looking for a replacement, someone with exceptional transfiguration skills and the temperament to teach young witches and wizards. Several of Minerva's former professors had recommended her for the position. Minerva read the letter 3 times, feeling a mixture of excitement and uncertainty. Teaching at Hogwarts had always been mentioned as a possible career path for her, but she had chosen the ministry first, wanting to make a difference in the broader wizarding world. But her time at the ministry had taught her that real change happened slowly, if at all, that individual cases mattered more than grand gestures, that maybe she could make more of a difference by shaping young minds than by trying to reform a resistant bureaucracy. She thought about her own time at Hogwarts, about the professors who had influenced her, who had encouraged her love of learning and her pursuit of excellence. Professor Beery had been one of those key figures, recognizing her talent and pushing her to achieve more than she thought possible. What if she could do that for other students? What if she could inspire the next generation of witches and wizards, could teach them not just transfiguration, but also the values of justice and integrity that seemed lacking in so much of the adult wizarding world? Minerva wrote back to Headmaster Dippet, expressing her interest in the position. She was invited to Hogwarts for an interview, where she met with Dippet and several other professors, including Albus Dumbledore, who taught Transfiguration to the older students and had a reputation as one of the most brilliant wizards alive. Dumbledore was younger then, though still considerably older than Minerva, probably in his 60s, with auburn hair beginning to silver and blue eyes that seemed to see through to your soul. The interview involved both a discussion of her teaching philosophy and a practical demonstration of her transfiguration abilities. Minerva explained her belief that education should be rigorous but fair, that students needed high standards to aspire to, but also support to reach those standards. She talked about the importance of understanding theory as well as practicing technique, of knowing not just how to perform a transformation, but why it worked the way it did. For the practical demonstration, she was asked to perform several advanced transformations. She transfigured a cat into a crystal goblet so perfectly that Dumbledore said he couldn't detect any remaining traces of the animal. She conjured a flock of birds from thin air, made them fly around the room, then vanished them completely. Finally, she performed a piece of human transfiguration on herself, temporarily giving herself the head of a cat before reversing the transformation. This was particularly dangerous magic that could go very wrong if not done perfectly, but Minerva executed it flawlessly. Headmaster Dippet offered her the position on the spot. She would start in September of 1856 as the new Transfiguration professor, teaching 1st through 5th years, while Dumbledore continued to teach 6th and 7th year students. The salary was less than what she made at the ministry, but Minerva didn't care. She accepted immediately, feeling more certain about this decision than she had felt about anything since choosing to end her relationship with Dougal. Leaving the ministry was straightforward. Minerva gave her notice, finished her current cases, and said goodbye to the few colleagues she had genuinely liked. Most of her co-workers were surprised by her decision to leave for teaching, viewing it as a step down from ministry work. But a few understood, recognizing that Minerva needed something more meaningful than bureaucratic law enforcement could provide. Returning to Hogwarts as a professor felt both familiar and strange. The castle looked exactly as Minerva remembered it, unchanged by the decades since her graduation, but her role was completely different now. Instead of sitting at the Gryffindor table as a student, she sat at the staff table, looking out at the 4 house tables. Instead of attending classes, she taught them. Instead of worrying about homework and exams, she assigned them and graded them. Her teaching style was firm but fair from the very beginning. Minerva had high expectations for her students and made those expectations clear. She demanded attention in class, perfect attendance unless illness prevented it, and homework completed on time with no excuses. She didn't tolerate fooling around or time wasting. Transfiguration was difficult and dangerous magic that required complete focus. One mistake, one moment of inattention, could result in permanent partial transformation or other serious magical accidents. But within her strict framework, Minerva was also supportive and encouraging. Students who worked hard and gave their best effort found her willing to offer extra help, to stay after class answering questions, to provide additional instruction for those who struggled. She developed a reputation for being tough, but ultimately caring about her students' success. Those who put in the effort found her fairness and her genuine desire to see them succeed. Those who were lazy or disruptive, found her utterly uncompromising. Her first few years of teaching established patterns that would continue throughout her career. She arrived at every class exactly on time, never early or late, and expected her students to do the same. She kept her classroom immaculately organized, with every tool and ingredient in its proper place. Her lessons were structured and clear, building logically from simple concepts to complex applications. She demonstrated each spell or transformation herself, before asking students to attempt it, showing them exactly what success looked like. Minerva also developed a keen eye for spotting natural talent in Transfiguration. She could tell within the first few lessons which students had the focus and control necessary to excel at this branch of magic, and which would struggle no matter how hard they tried. For those with talent, she pushed them to reach their full potential, never accepting mediocrity when excellence was achievable. For those who struggled, she provided patient instruction and modified expectations, recognizing that not everyone could be brilliant at Transfiguration, but that everyone could learn the basics if they tried. Her relationship with Albus Dumbledore, who taught the advanced Transfiguration classes, was collegial and respectful. Dumbledore had a very different teaching style than Minerva. Where she was structured and strict, he was whimsical and relaxed. Where she demanded precision, he encouraged creativity and experimentation. But they shared a deep love of Transfiguration and a commitment to educating young witches and wizards. They often consulted on curriculum development, discussed particularly talented or troubled students, and occasionally collaborated on magical research projects. Dumbledore saw something special in Minerva from the beginning. He recognized not just her exceptional magical abilities, but also her strong moral compass, her dedication to doing what was right even when it was difficult. He began including her in discussions about school policies and student discipline issues, valuing her perspective and her judgment. This informal mentorship would deepen over the years, eventually leading to Minerva becoming one of Dumbledore's most trusted colleagues and advisors. After 3 years of teaching, in 1859, Minerva achieved something she had been working towards since her student days. She became a registered Animagus. The process had taken her nearly 2 years of preparation and practice, conducted in secret during her limited free time. She had followed the traditional method exactly, keeping a single mandrake leaf in her mouth for an entire month from full moon to full moon. This had been incredibly difficult, requiring her to speak carefully to avoid dislodging the leaf, to avoid swallowing it during meals or sleep, to keep it hidden from everyone around her. After the month ended, she had placed the leaf in a crystal phial with one of her own hairs, added silver teaspoon of dew that had been collected from a place that had seen neither sunlight nor human feet for 7 days, and included a chrysalis of a death's head hawk moth. The potion had to be stored in a dark, quiet place and left undisturbed until the next electrical storm. Minerva had placed her phial in a rarely used storage room in the castle dungeons and waited with increasing impatience for a storm to arrive. When a thunderstorm finally rolled across the Scottish Highlands, Minerva had retrieved her potion and taken it to an isolated area of the castle grounds. The potion had turned blood red, which according to the instructions meant it was ready. She had drunk it at the height of the storm, with lightning flashing overhead and thunder shaking the ground. The taste was indescribably horrible, but she forced herself to swallow every drop. Then she had focused her mind and intention on transformation, on becoming her animal form. She felt a strange doubling of her heartbeat, a sensation like a second heart beating alongside her own. She pointed her wand at her chest and incanted, "Amato, animo, animato, animagus." the traditional spell that would reveal what animal form her inner nature had taken. A bright light had emerged from her wand, forming a silvery shape in the air. A cat. Not just any cat, but a tabby cat with distinctive square markings around its eyes that looked remarkably like the spectacles Minerva had recently started wearing for reading. The actual transformation had taken practice. At first, she could only manage partial changes, giving herself cat eyes or whiskers without fully transforming. But she persisted, practicing in private, until one evening, she successfully transformed completely into a small tabby cat. The experience was extraordinary and disorienting. Her senses changed, becoming sharper in some ways and duller in others. She could see better in the dark, could hear sounds she never noticed as a human, could smell scents that painted detailed pictures of her surroundings. But colors were muted, and she had an almost overwhelming urge to chase small moving objects. After ensuring she could transform reliably and return to human form without difficulty, Minerva registered with the ministry's Animagus registry as required by law. Her registration was recorded in the official records, noting that her animal form was a silver tabby cat with square markings around the eyes. She was only the 7th registered Animagus in the 20th century, a testament to how rare and difficult this magic was to achieve. Being an Animagus proved useful in various ways throughout her career. As a cat, she could move through the castle unnoticed, could observe students when they thought no teachers were watching, could patrol the grounds and corridors more effectively than any human could. She sometimes used her cat form to check on troubled students who might not open up to a professor, but would pet and talk to a friendly cat. It also gave her a deeper understanding of transfiguration magic, having experienced the transformation from the inside. In 1860, 4 years after she had started teaching, Minerva was offered the position of head of Gryffindor House. The previous head had retired, and Headmaster Dippet felt Minerva was ready for the additional responsibility, despite her relative youth. Being head of house meant being responsible for all the Gryffindor students, not just those in her classes. She would oversee their pastoral care, handle disciplinary issues specific to Gryffindors, arrange the class schedules, and serve as the primary point of contact between the students and the school administration. Minerva accepted the position with both pride and some trepidation. She had only been teaching for 4 years, was still learning the nuances of educational leadership, and would now be responsible for roughly a quarter of the entire student body. But she was also deeply committed to Gryffindor House, to the values of courage and bravery that the house represented, and she was determined to serve her students well. As head of Gryffindor, Minerva became even more involved in her students' lives. She held regular house meetings, addressed problems or concerns, mediated conflicts between students, and worked to build house unity and pride. She took Gryffindor's performance in both academics and Quidditch seriously, celebrating successes and working to address failures. Under her leadership, Gryffindor consistently competed for the House Cup, and the House Quidditch team became one of the strongest in the school. The decades that followed saw Minerva settle into her dual role as Transfiguration Professor and head of Gryffindor House. She taught thousands of students over the years, watched them arrive as nervous 11-year-olds and leave as young adults ready to make their mark on the wizarding world. Some went on to distinguished careers at the ministry. Others became successful business owners or researchers. Some became teachers themselves. A few, sadly, made poor choices and ended up in Azkaban or died young in various conflicts. Minerva remembered many of her students long after they left Hogwarts, the particularly talented ones who had shown exceptional promise in Transfiguration. The troublemakers who had tested her patience, but whom she had helped turn around. The quiet ones who had needed encouragement to believe in themselves. The ones who had faced personal tragedies or difficulties and had needed support to get through their school years. Each generation brought new personalities, new challenges, new opportunities to make a difference. In the late 1860s and early 1870s, the wizarding world remained relatively peaceful. There were the usual minor conflicts and political tensions, but no major threats to stability. Minerva focused on her teaching and her house duties, occasionally consulting on ministry cases when her expertise was needed, but largely remaining within the educational sphere. She lived in her quarters at Hogwarts year-round, rarely taking extended holidays, finding fulfillment in her work and her connection to the castle and its students. When Armando Dipper finally retired as headmaster in 1965, after leading Hogwarts for longer than most people lived, the question of his successor became paramount. Many expected the position to go to one of the senior professors, possibly Herbert Beery, who had taught Transfiguration for decades before Minerva. But Beery had already retired years earlier and had no interest in returning. The Board of Governors ultimately offered the position to Albus Dumbledore, who had become the most famous wizard alive after his defeat of Grindelwald 2 decades earlier. Dumbledore accepted the position of headmaster, and this meant changes for the staff structure. His teaching position needed to be filled, and he immediately thought of Minerva. She had been teaching Transfiguration to younger students for nearly a decade, had proven herself an exceptional educator, and had the skills to teach the most advanced students. Dumbledore offered her the position of full Transfiguration professor, teaching all years from 1st through 7th. Minerva accepted gratefully. Teaching the Nabuti level students was particularly rewarding, as these were the most dedicated and talented students who had chosen to continue with Transfiguration at the highest level. She could teach them magic that approached what she herself was capable of, could push them to understand not just how to perform transformations, but the deep theoretical underpinnings of why Transfiguration worked the way it did. Around this time, Dumbledore also created the position of deputy headmistress and offered it to Minerva. This would make her second in command at Hogwarts, responsible for assisting with school administration, representing the headmaster when he was away, and eventually taking over if anything happened to him. It was an enormous responsibility and a sign of the deep trust and respect Dumbledore had for her abilities and judgment. Again, Minerva accepted, though with some hesitation. She was now teaching full-time, serving as head of Gryffindor House, and would be deputy headmistress. It was an almost overwhelming amount of responsibility, but she was organized and efficient, could manage her time effectively, and felt honored that Dumbledore had such confidence in her. She threw herself into her new duties with characteristic determination and competence. The 1970s brought significant changes to the wizarding world. A dark wizard calling himself Lord Voldemort had been gaining power and followers for years, but by the early 70s, his activities had become more open and more violent. He and his Death Eaters, as his followers called themselves, were attacking Muggleborns and those who defended them, pushing for pure blood supremacy and the elimination of anyone they deemed unworthy of magic. Minerva watched these developments with growing alarm. She had seen prejudice and bigotry in the wizarding world throughout her life, but Voldemort was taking it to new extremes. His ideology reminded her uncomfortably of Grindelwald decades earlier, another charismatic dark wizard who had convinced followers that might made right, that those with magical power should rule over those without. She knew from history that such movements had to be opposed early and firmly, or they would grow until stopping them required devastating conflict. When Dumbledore formed the Order of the Phoenix, a secret organization dedicated to fighting Voldemort and his Death Eaters, Minerva joined immediately. She was one of the original members, bringing her considerable magical skills and her commitment to protecting innocent people from dark wizards. The Order operated outside official ministry channels because Voldemort had already infiltrated parts of the government. They fought Death Eaters directly, protected targets of attacks, gathered intelligence, and worked to undermine Voldemort's plans. The work was dangerous. Order members died or were captured and tortured. Minerva participated in numerous battles and skirmishes, using her transfiguration skills both offensively and defensively. She could transfigure objects into shields or weapons, could transform enemies' robes into ropes to bind them, could create distractions and obstacles that allowed allies to escape or gain advantage. Her Animagus form also proved useful for reconnaissance, as a cat could go places and hear things that a human witch couldn't access. But Minerva's primary responsibility remained Hogwarts and her students. Even as she fought in the war during holidays and weekends, she maintained her teaching schedule and her duties as deputy headmistress and head of Gryffindor. She was determined that Hogwarts would remain safe, that students would be protected from the violence consuming the adult wizarding world. Under Dumbledore's leadership and with Minerva's help, Hogwarts became known as the safest place in Britain. Voldemort would never directly attack the school while Dumbledore lived there. During this period, Minerva taught several students who would become important figures in the war. James Potter arrived at Hogwarts in 1971, sorted into Gryffindor along with his friends Sirius Black, Remus Lupin, and Peter Pettigrew. The four boys became inseparable, calling themselves the Marauders and causing more trouble than any group of students Minerva had dealt with in years. James Potter was talented but arrogant, from a wealthy pure-blood family, but without the prejudice that often came with that background. He was brilliant at transfiguration, picking up complex transformations with apparent ease. But he was also irresponsible and often cruel, particularly to students he didn't like. His main target was Severus Snape, a Slytherin student who seemed to bring out the worst in James. Sirius Black was from the ancient House of Black, one of the oldest and most fanatically pure-blood families in Britain. But Sirius had rejected his family's values, was sorted into Gryffindor instead of Slytherin, like every Black before him, and dedicated himself to opposing everything his family stood for. He was almost as talented as James, almost as arrogant, and equally prone to breaking rules and causing chaos. Remus Lupin was quieter than his friends, more studious and thoughtful. Minerva didn't learn until later that Remus was a werewolf, bitten as a child and forced to transform every full moon. Dumbledore had made special arrangements to allow Remus to attend Hogwarts safely, using the Shrieking Shack as a place where he could transform without endangering others. James and Sirius had discovered their friend's secret and, in an impressive display of magical skill, had become unregistered animagi so they could accompany Remus during his transformations. Peter Pettigrew was the least impressive of the four, always following the other's lead, never quite as skilled or clever. Minerva felt some sympathy for Peter, sensing that he tagged along with James and Sirius because he craved the reflected glory of being friends with the most popular boys in their year. But she also sensed something weak in him, something that made her slightly uncomfortable, though she couldn't articulate exactly what bothered her. The Marauders tested Minerva's patience constantly. They broke curfew, set off dung bombs in corridors, hexed students they didn't like, and generally treated school rules as suggestions rather than requirements. Minerva assigned them detention after detention, deducted countless house points from Gryffindor, wrote letters to their parents. Nothing seemed to make a lasting impression. They would behave for a week or two, then return to their troublemaking ways. What particularly frustrated Minerva was that they were all talented enough to excel academically without the extra effort other students needed. James and Sirius especially could have been top students if they had applied themselves seriously. Instead, they coasted on natural ability, doing just enough work to achieve good grades while spending most of their energy on pranks and mischief. It seemed like such a waste of potential. There was also the matter of their treatment of Severus Snape. Minerva witnessed several incidents where James and Sirius bullied Snape, sometimes with Remus and Peter watching or even participating. The bullying was often vicious and humiliating, going far beyond normal student rivalry. Snape gave as good as he got with his knowledge of dark curses, but it was usually 4 against 1, and James in particular seemed to have a personal hatred for the Slytherin student that went beyond reasonable dislike. Minerva intervened when she caught them, assigning detentions and deducting points. But she knew she wasn't catching every incident. That much of the conflict happened out of her sight. She spoke to James several times about his behavior, trying to make him understand that true courage didn't involve tormenting someone weaker or outnumbered. James always claimed Snape started it, that he was only defending himself or his friends, that Snape deserved whatever he got for associating with future Death Eaters in Slytherin House. There was some truth to James's claims. Snape did associate with students who openly admired Voldemort, who used slurs against Muggleborns, who practiced dark magic in secret. Minerva had concerns about many of the Slytherin students during this period, seeing how Voldemort's influence was reaching even into Hogwarts, but that didn't excuse James's behavior, didn't make the bullying acceptable. She tried to maintain fairness, punishing both sides when they broke rules, but it was a constant challenge. Despite her frustrations with the Marauders, Minerva couldn't help but feel some affection for them, particularly as they matured in their later years. By 6th and 7th year, James had calmed down somewhat, had become more responsible. He was made head boy in his final year, a decision Minerva had privately questioned but that Dumbledore had felt was appropriate. James took the responsibility seriously, seemed to genuinely try to be a better person. He also began dating Lily Evans, a brilliant Muggle-born witch who refused to give him the time of day until he started acting like someone worth knowing. Lily Evans was one of Minerva's favourite students, though she tried not to show favouritism. Lily was exceptionally talented, particularly in charms and potions, but also worked harder than almost anyone else in her year. She was kind to younger students, stood up against bullying and prejudice, and had a strong moral compass that reminded Minerva of herself at that age. Watching James and Lily fall in love was interesting, seeing how Lily's influence made James want to be better, how he became less arrogant and more thoughtful when trying to impress her. The Marauders graduated in 1978, just as the First Wizarding War was reaching its most intense phase. Minerva knew that all 4 of them joined the Order of the Phoenix immediately after leaving school, that they were fighting Death Eaters and risking their lives. She worried about them, particularly Remus, who faced prejudice as a werewolf on top of the normal dangers, and Peter, who seemed ill-suited for the harsh realities of war. In 1979, Minerva learned that James and Lily had married. She was happy for them, hoped they would find some peace and happiness despite the war raging around them. Then, in 1980, word came that Lily was pregnant. A child being born into such dark times seemed both hopeful and terrifying. What kind of world would this baby grow up in? Would Voldemort be defeated before the child was old enough to understand the danger? Or would they grow up in a world where darkness had won? Around this same time, a prophecy was made about a child who would have the power to defeat Voldemort. Minerva didn't know the full details, but she knew that Dumbledore took it very seriously, that he believed this prophecy might be the key to ending the war. She also knew that Voldemort learned about the prophecy and became obsessed with finding and killing the child it referred to. Then came the terrible news in October of 1981. Voldemort had attacked the Potters. James and Lily were dead, but their baby son Harry had somehow survived, and Voldemort had been destroyed, reduced to less than a ghost. The war was over, the Death Eaters were scattered, and the wizarding world was celebrating. But Minerva could only think about James and Lily, two of her former students who had been so young and full of promise, now dead. And their infant son was orphaned, his life forever marked by tragedy before he was old enough to understand what had happened. On the night of November 1st, Minerva went to Privet Drive in her cat form. She had learned that Dumbledore planned to leave Harry with his Muggle relatives, the Dursleys. Minerva had serious reservations about this plan. She had heard about Petunia Dursley, Lily's sister, and none of what she heard suggested that the Dursleys would be good guardians for a magical child. But Dumbledore had explained about the blood protection, about how Harry would be safe there in ways he wouldn't be anywhere else. Minerva understood the reasoning, but still worried about what kind of childhood Harry would have. She sat on the wall outside number 4 Privet Drive all day, watching the house, watching the neighborhood. When Dumbledore finally arrived late that evening, Minerva transformed back to her human form and confronted him. She argued that the Dursleys were the worst sort of Muggles, that they would be cruel to Harry, that he deserved better than to be left on a doorstep like a parcel. Dumbledore listened patiently to her concerns, but remained firm in his decision. Harry would be safest with his mother's blood relatives, and that safety was more important than comfort or happiness. Hagrid arrived on Sirius Black's flying motorcycle, carrying baby Harry wrapped in blankets. The child was asleep, seemingly unaware that his entire life had just changed forever. Minerva looked at the lightning bolt scar on his forehead, the mark left by Voldemort's curse, and felt her heart break for this infant who had already lost so much. Dumbledore placed Harry on the doorstep, with a letter explaining the situation to the Dursleys, and then the three of them left. Minerva looked back once, seeing the bundle on the doorstep, and had to force herself to keep walking. The years that followed were strange for Minerva and for the entire wizarding world. Voldemort was gone, and the Death Eaters were being rounded up and sent to Azkaban. The trials were rushed and sometimes unfair, with some innocent people imprisoned based on suspicion, while others who were genuinely guilty went free because they claimed to have been under the Imperious curse. Sirius Black was sent to Azkaban without even receiving a trial, believed to have betrayed the Potters and killed Peter Pettigrew along with 12 Muggles. Minerva was shocked by this news, couldn't reconcile the Sirius she had taught with someone who would betray his best friends. But the evidence seemed conclusive, and no one questioned the conviction at the time. Life at Hogwarts slowly returned to normal. Students who had been afraid to walk the corridors at night relaxed. Families who had been in hiding came out. The constant tension of wartime began to ease. Minerva continued her teaching, her duties as deputy headmistress and head of Gryffindor, trying to rebuild some sense of normalcy for her students who had spent years living in fear. But she couldn't stop thinking about Harry Potter. She wondered how he was doing with the Dursleys, whether they were treating him well, whether he was happy. Dumbledore had arranged for people to keep an eye on him, but from a distance, without interfering. Minerva had to trust that Harry was safe, and that when the time came for him to attend Hogwarts, they would be able to give him the education and support he deserved. The 1980s and early 90s passed relatively peacefully. Minerva taught new generations of students, maintained discipline and academic standards, supported her Gryffindors in their various endeavours. She watched students come and go, each class bringing new personalities and challenges. Some years were easier than others. Some classes had students who seemed determined to test every rule and push every boundary. Others were more compliant and focused on their studies. Minerva's teaching style never wavered. She remained strict but fair, demanding excellence while supporting those who genuinely tried. Her classroom was always perfectly organized, her lessons always well planned and executed with precision. Students still complained that she was too harsh, too uncompromising, but they also grudgingly admitted that they learned more in her class than in almost any other, that her high standards pushed them to achieve more than they thought possible. As deputy headmistress, Minerva handled much of the day-to-day administration that kept Hogwarts running smoothly. She created the class schedules each year, a monumentally complex task involving hundreds of students, dozens of professors, and limited classroom space. She handled disciplinary issues that didn't require the headmaster's direct involvement. She represented Hogwarts at various ministry functions and educational conferences. She served on the board of governors in an advisory capacity, providing insight into how proposed policies would actually affect the school and its students. Her relationship with Dumbledore deepened during these years into genuine friendship and professional partnership. They didn't always agree. Minerva was more cautious and traditional, while Dumbledore was willing to take risks and break conventions when he felt it necessary. But they respected each other's judgment and worked together effectively to lead Hogwarts. Minerva became one of the few people Dumbledore truly confided in, who knew at least some of his secrets and his long-term plans. Then, in 1991, everything changed again. Harry Potter's 11th birthday was approaching, which meant it was time for him to receive his Hogwarts letter and begin his magical education. Minerva was both excited and apprehensive about Harry coming to Hogwarts. She had watched his parents grow up, had taught them, had seen them die fighting for what was right. Now their son would walk the same corridors, sit in the same classrooms, begin his own journey in the magical world. Hagrid was sent to fetch Harry and bring him to Diagon Alley for school shopping, since the Dursleys had apparently tried to prevent Harry from learning about magic. When Minerva heard about this, her worst fears about the Dursleys were confirmed. They had lied to Harry about his parents' deaths, had tried to stamp out any hint of magic in him, had made him sleep in a cupboard under the stairs. She was furious, but could do nothing about it now. Harry would be coming to Hogwarts, would be safe and properly educated, and that would have to be enough. September 1st, 1991, arrived with the usual excitement and chaos of the start of a new school year. Minerva stood in the entrance hall, waiting for the first years to arrive, watching the older students stream into the Great Hall. She felt more nervous than usual, knowing that among the first years would be Harry Potter, the boy who had survived the killing curse, the child who had somehow destroyed Voldemort when he was barely more than a baby. When the first years finally arrived, wet from crossing the lake and wide-eyed at their first sight of the castle interior, Minerva gave her usual speech about the houses and the sorting. Her eyes found Harry Potter easily in the group. He was small for his age, thin, wearing glasses that looked too large for his face and clothes that clearly didn't fit properly. He had his mother's green eyes, she noticed immediately, though everything else about his appearance came from his father. The lightning bolt scar on his forehead was visible beneath his messy black hair. The sorting ceremony proceeded as normal. Students were called forward alphabetically. The sorting hat was placed on their heads and houses were announced. Minerva watched Harry's sorting with particular interest. The hat took longer than usual with him, seeming to have a lengthy internal debate. Finally, after what felt like several minutes, but was probably less than one, the hat shouted, "Gryffindor." The Gryffindor table erupted in cheers, and Harry walked to join his new housemates, looking both relieved and somewhat overwhelmed. Over the following days and weeks, Minerva observed Harry carefully. He seemed to be adjusting well to Hogwarts, had made friends with Ron Weasley and Hermione Granger, two other first years in Gryffindor. Hermione in particular reminded Minerva of herself at that age, brilliant and hard-working, with a need to prove herself through academic excellence. Harry was quieter, more reserved, but showed flashes of the same courage and determination his parents had possessed. In Transfiguration class, Harry proved to be a competent student, not exceptional like his mother had been, but solid and willing to work hard. Minerva appreciated that he didn't rest on his fame, that he approached his studies seriously despite the constant attention he received from other students. She tried to treat him the same as any other student, not giving him special consideration, but also not being harder on him because of his celebrity status. The first year brought several crises that tested both Harry and the school. The Philosopher's Stone was hidden at Hogwarts, protected by various enchantments and obstacles. Minerva had contributed one of the protections, a giant chess set that required genuine strategic skill to pass. When Harry, Ron, and Hermione went after the stone to prevent it from being stolen, Minerva was initially furious that they had broken so many rules and put themselves in such danger. But she also recognized the courage it had taken, the willingness to risk their lives to protect something important. She awarded them house points for their bravery, helping Gryffindor win the House Cup that year. Harry's second year brought the Chamber of Secrets crisis. Students were being attacked and petrified. Messages about the heir of Slytherin appeared written in blood on walls, and fear spread through the castle. Minerva worked closely with Dumbledore to investigate what was happening, to protect students, and to prevent the school from being closed by the Ministry. When Hermione Granger was petrified, Minerva felt personally responsible, as though she had failed to protect one of her Gryffindors. The revelation that the chamber had been opened by Tom Riddle's memory, preserved in a diary, that a basilisk had been living in the castle's plumbing for decades, was both shocking and disturbing. That Harry had gone down into the chamber and killed the basilisk, saving Ginny Weasley's life in the process, demonstrated once again the extraordinary courage that seemed to run in the Potter family. Minerva was proud of him, but also deeply concerned about the pattern that was emerging. Harry seemed to attract danger, or perhaps danger was attracted to him. Either way, his time at Hogwarts was proving to be anything but ordinary. Third year brought Sirius Black's escape from Azkaban and the return of Dementors to Hogwarts grounds. Minerva had complicated feelings about Sirius. She had taught him, had seen his potential and his flaws. Learning that he had supposedly betrayed James and Lily, had killed Peter Pettigrew and 12 Muggles, had devastated her. She had never imagined one of her students would fall so far, would become so evil. Having him escape and potentially threaten Harry added another layer of worry to her already considerable responsibilities. The truth about that night, when it finally came out, turned everything Minerva thought she knew upside down. Sirius was innocent. Peter Pettigrew, whom everyone had believed dead, was actually alive and had been the real traitor. He had been living as Ron Weasley's pet rat for years, hiding in plain sight at Hogwarts. The injustice of it, that Sirius had spent 12 years in Azkaban for crimes he didn't commit, while the real criminal lived free, made Minerva furious at the failures of the wizarding justice system. Though Sirius couldn't be publicly exonerated without Peter as proof, Harry now knew the truth about his godfather. He had family, someone who had loved his parents and who wanted to be part of his life. Minerva was glad for Harry, hoped that knowing Sirius would give him some connection to his parents, some sense of belonging beyond what Hogwarts could provide. Fourth year and the Tri-Wizard tournament brought new challenges and ultimately tragedy. When Harry's name came out of the Goblet of Fire, despite him being too young to enter, Minerva was immediately suspicious. Someone had entered his name, had put him in danger deliberately. Throughout the tournament, she watched Harry struggle with tasks designed for older, more experienced wizards. She was proud of how well he performed, but also worried constantly about his safety. The night Harry returned from the third task, carrying Cedric Diggory's body and claiming that Voldemort had returned, was one of the worst of Minerva's long life. Cedric dead, Harry traumatized, and the Dark Lord restored to power. She had hoped never to see another war, had hoped that Voldemort's defeat 14 years earlier had been permanent. But here they were again, facing the same evil that had killed so many the first time. The Ministry's refusal to believe that Voldemort had returned, their campaign to discredit both Harry and Dumbledore, made the situation even worse. Cornelius Fudge was more concerned with maintaining his own power than with protecting people from real threats. Minerva watched with growing frustration as the Ministry undermined Hogwarts, as they spread lies through the Daily Prophet, as they left the wizarding world unprepared for the war that was coming. Fifth year brought Dolores Umbridge to Hogwarts, and with her, one of the most difficult periods in Minerva's entire career. Umbridge was appointed as defense against the dark arts teacher by the Ministry, but her real purpose was to monitor Hogwarts, and particularly Dumbledore. She was cruel, petty, and drunk on what little power she had been given. Her refusal to actually teach defensive magic, her use of sadistic punishments like forcing students to carve words into their own hands with blood quills, her systematic dismantling of everything good about Hogwarts made Minerva's blood boil. As Umbridge gained more power through her various appointments as High Inquisitor and eventually Headmistress, Minerva found herself walking a careful line. She had to oppose Umbridge without giving her excuses to fire staff members or harm students. She had to maintain order and discipline while also supporting student resistance to unjust authority. It was exhausting and infuriating, requiring every bit of self-control Minerva possessed. The formation of Dumbledore's army, the secret student defense group that Harry led, was technically a violation of Umbridge's rules. When Minerva learned about it, she was torn between her duty to enforce school rules and her knowledge that students needed to learn proper defensive magic that Umbridge refused to teach. She never explicitly endorsed the group, but she also didn't try very hard to discover who was involved or to shut it down. Sometimes, she decided, the right thing to do was to look the other way. When Umbridge and her inquisitorial squad caught Harry and several other students when it looked like they would be expelled or worse, Minerva stood up for them as forcefully as she dared. She argued with Umbridge, protected students from her worst impulses, and made it clear that she found the High Inquisitor's methods unacceptable. This led to increasing tension between them, with Umbridge clearly seeing Minerva as an obstacle to her complete control of the school. The confrontation that would haunt Minerva came when she and several other teachers tried to stop Umbridge and Aurors from forcibly removing Hagrid from his position as gamekeeper. Minerva stepped between them, defending her colleague, refusing to let them take him without cause. What happened next came so fast she barely had time to react. 4 stunners hit her in the chest simultaneously, powerful enough that they should have killed someone her age. She fell, unconscious before she hit the ground, her body broken by the force of the spells. She woke days later in St. Mungo's Hospital, having missed the events at the Ministry where Voldemort's return was finally confirmed publicly. Her chest ached, her magic felt depleted, and she was furious that she had been sidelined during such a critical time. The healers told her she was lucky to be alive, that the only reason she survived was her own considerable magical strength, and the fact that she had been healthy for someone of her advanced age. They kept her in the hospital for several weeks, making sure the damage had healed properly before allowing her to return to Hogwarts. 6th year began with the wizarding world finally united in knowing that Voldemort had returned and war was coming. The Daily Prophet had been forced to print the truth. Fudge had been replaced as minister, and the Ministry was finally taking defensive measures. But people were frightened, and that fear manifested in various ways at Hogwarts. Some students were pulled from school by worried parents. Others stayed, but were distracted and anxious, struggling to focus on their studies when they knew their families were in danger. Minerva worked to maintain some sense of normalcy, to keep Hogwarts functioning as a place of learning and safety. But it was difficult when Death Eaters were attacking in Hogsmeade, when students' family members were being killed or injured, when the entire wizarding world felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for the next assault. She increased patrols of the castle, implemented additional security measures, and worked with the other professors to watch for students who might be recruited by Death Eaters or otherwise compromised. Harry was taking private lessons with Dumbledore that year, learning things about Voldemort that Minerva wasn't privy to. She trusted Dumbledore's judgment, but worried about the burden being placed on a 16-year-old boy. Whatever Dumbledore was preparing Harry for, it was clearly something significant, something dangerous. Minerva remembered the prophecy that had been made before Harry's birth, though she didn't know its exact wording. She suspected it had something to do with why Dumbledore was investing so much time in Harry's education. The night Death Eaters broke into Hogwarts through a cursed necklace and a pair of vanishing cabinets, Minerva was patrolling corridors when she heard the commotion. She rushed toward the sounds of battle, stunning several Death Eaters on her way. She reached the base of the astronomy tower just in time to see Dumbledore fall from the top, his body tumbling through the air before hitting the ground with a sickening impact. The grief and shock she felt in that moment was overwhelming. Dumbledore was dead. Her colleague, her friend, her mentor for over a century. The greatest wizard alive, the one person Voldemort truly feared, was gone. And with him went any sense that Hogwarts was untouchable, that students would be safe within the castle walls. If Death Eaters could get into Hogwarts, if they could kill Dumbledore himself, then nowhere was safe. The days that followed were a blur of funeral arrangements, discussions with the Ministry, and meetings with staff about what would happen next. The Board of Governors wanted to close Hogwarts permanently, arguing that it was too dangerous to remain open. Minerva fought against this with every argument she could muster. Closing Hogwarts would be giving Voldemort exactly what he wanted, would deprive young witches and wizards of their education and their one true sanctuary. If Hogwarts closed, Voldemort had essentially won without having to fight the final battles. She was asked to take over as headmistress, at least temporarily. Minerva accepted, though the circumstances were far from what she would have wanted. She had always known she might someday lead Hogwarts, but she had hoped it would be years in the future, under peaceful conditions, after Dumbledore had retired naturally. Instead, she was thrust into the position during wartime, with Dumbledore murdered and the school under threat. But before she could truly step into the role, before the new school year even began, the Ministry fell to Voldemort. The war that had been building for years suddenly reached its critical point. Voldemort's forces took over the government, installed Death Eaters in positions of power, and began implementing policies designed to identify and eliminate Muggle-borns. It was Grindelwald's vision made real, wizarding supremacy, enforced through violence and terror. Hogwarts was forced to reopen under Ministry control. Severus Snape, whom everyone believed had murdered Dumbledore, was appointed headmaster. Minerva was demoted back to deputy headmistress and Transfiguration professor. 2 Death Eaters, Amicus and Electo Caro, were brought in to teach dark arts and oversee discipline. The changes they implemented were designed to turn Hogwarts into a training ground for dark wizards, to break the spirit of students who opposed Voldemort, to transform the school into something unrecognizable. The year that followed was the darkest in Hogwarts history. The Carrows used Cruciatus curses on students as punishment. They made students practice dark magic on each other. They promoted pure blood supremacy and encouraged students to inform on classmates who spoke against Voldemort. Minerva watched her school, the place she had dedicated her life to protecting, become a place of fear and cruelty. She did what she could to protect students from the worst of it. She intercepted punishments when possible, created opportunities for students to avoid the Carrows' classes, provided hidden support to those who resisted. But she had to be careful, had to avoid doing anything so obvious that she would be removed from her position, or worse. As long as she remained at Hogwarts, she could protect some students some of the time. If she was forced out or killed, there would be no one left to stand between the Death Eaters and the children in their care. Harry, Ron, and Hermione didn't return to Hogwarts that year. Minerva knew they were doing something important for Dumbledore, some mission he had given them before his death. She didn't know the details, but she trusted that whatever it was crucial to defeating Voldemort. She kept watch for any news of them, hoping they were safe, hoping they would succeed in whatever they were attempting. The students who did return that year showed remarkable courage. Neville Longbottom, in particular, grew into a leader of the resistance within Hogwarts. He reformed Dumbledore's army, organized acts of defiance against the Carrows, protected younger students from punishment. Minerva was so proud of him, she could hardly stand it. The boy who had been clumsy and uncertain in first year had become a true Gryffindor, brave and determined, and absolutely unwilling to bow to tyranny. Then came the night of May 2nd, 1998. Harry Potter returned to Hogwarts, and with his return came the final battle. Voldemort's forces surrounded the castle, demanding that Harry be turned over to them. Minerva and the other professors prepared to defend the school, to protect their students, to fight for everything Hogwarts represented. When Snape tried to maintain his position as headmaster, when he stood in the Great Hall and demanded that students inform on Harry's whereabouts, Minerva had finally had enough. She challenged him directly, forced him to duel her in front of the entire school. It felt good to finally act openly, to stop pretending to submit to Death Eater authority. Snape fled after a brief exchange of spells, jumping through a window and disappearing into the night. Minerva took command of the school's defense, the position that should have been hers all along. The evacuation of underage students was orderly and efficient. Those of age who wanted to stay and fight were allowed to do so. Minerva worked with the other professors to establish defensive positions, to activate ancient protections built into the castle's structure, to prepare for the assault they knew was coming. She cast powerful enchantments that brought the castle's statues and suits of armor to life, creating an army of stone and metal warriors to defend Hogwarts alongside its human defenders. The battle itself was chaos and carnage. Death Eaters and other dark creatures stormed the castle from multiple directions. Defenders fought them in corridors and classrooms, on staircases and in courtyards. Spells flew through the air in every colour, deadly curses mixing with defensive shields and counter-hexes. Minerva was everywhere at once, dueling Death Eaters, protecting students, organising defensive positions, casting the largest and most powerful spells she could manage. She duelled several Death Eaters simultaneously at various points during the battle, using every bit of Transfiguration knowledge she possessed. She animated desks and suits of armor to fight for her. She transfigured falling stones into birds that attacked Death Eaters from above. She created barriers and shields to protect wounded defenders. She fought with a ferocity born of decades of pent-up fury at what Voldemort and his followers had done to her world, her school, her students. The casualties mounted as the night wore on. Fred Weasley died in an explosion. Remus Lupin and Nymphadora Tonks fell in battle. Colin Creevey, who had been too young to fight but had stayed anyway, was found dead in the courtyard. Each loss hurt. Each name added to the terrible cost of this war. But they kept fighting because the alternative was unthinkable. If Voldemort won, if darkness triumphed, then everyone who had died would have sacrificed themselves for nothing. When Harry walked into the Forbidden Forest to surrender himself to Voldemort, Minerva didn't know what he was doing. She only knew that he had disappeared, that the defenders were starting to lose hope without his presence. Then Voldemort called for a ceasefire, announced that Harry Potter was dead, and demanded their surrender. Minerva felt something break inside her at those words. Harry dead, James and Lily's son killed at 17, just as they had been. The boy she had helped protect for 7 years, who had survived so much, gone. But Harry wasn't dead. When he revealed himself, when he and Voldemort duelled in the Great Hall with everyone watching, Minerva felt hope surge back to life. And when Voldemort's killing curse rebounded, when the Dark Lord crumbled to dust and the war was finally, truly over, she felt relief so intense it made her knees weak. They had won. Hogwarts stood. Harry lived. It was over. The aftermath of the battle was in some ways harder than the fighting itself. There were bodies to identify, families to notify, funerals to arrange. The castle was damaged, entire sections destroyed by curses and battles. Students needed counseling and support to process what they had witnessed and experienced. The wizarding world had to figure out how to rebuild after Voldemort's defeat, how to create a better society from the ruins of the old one. Minerva was officially appointed headmistress once Voldemort was defeated and the ministry was restored to legitimate leadership. She threw herself into rebuilding Hogwarts, both physically and spiritually. The castle repairs took months, with workers carefully restoring damaged sections, while preserving the historic character of the building. Some scars were left intentionally, markers of what had happened, reminders to future generations of the cost of fighting darkness. But more important than the physical repairs was rebuilding Hogwarts as an institution. The previous year had traumatized students and staff alike. Trust had been broken, innocence had been shattered, and young people had been forced to grow up far too quickly. Minerva worked to create a safe, nurturing environment where students could heal and learn without fear. She hired new professors to replace those who had died or left. She implemented new policies designed to prevent the kind of infiltration that had allowed Death Eaters to take over. She opened Hogwarts to all magical children, regardless of blood status, making it clear that pure blood supremacy had no place in her school. Harry, Ron, and Hermione did not return for their final year, choosing instead to move directly into their careers. Harry and Ron joined the Auror office, working to round up remaining Death Eaters and rebuild the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. Hermione took a key position at the Ministry, working on reforming unjust laws, particularly those dealing with non-human magical beings. Minerva understood their decision, but missed having them at Hogwarts, missed the chance to teach them their final year of magic. The students who did return, many of whom had fought in the battle, needed special consideration. Minerva created support systems, arranged for counselors to be available, modified curriculum to account for the education they had missed during the previous year. She made sure that those who had lost family members or been otherwise affected by the war received whatever help they needed. Hogwarts had always been a sanctuary, but now it also needed to be a place of healing. Minerva served as headmistress for many years after the war, guiding Hogwarts through the transition from wartime to peace. She watched a new generation of students arrive, children who had grown up hearing stories about the Battle of Hogwarts, but who hadn't lived through the fear and darkness of Voldemort's reign. She made sure those stories were told accurately, that students understood both the courage of those who fought and the terrible cost of war. She also ensured that the mistakes of the past weren't repeated. She maintained strong relationships with the Ministry, but refused to allow political interference in Hogwarts' operation. She insisted on rigorous academic standards, while also making sure that students received emotional and social support. She updated the curriculum to include more practical defensive magic, more education about dark wizards and how they rose to power, more emphasis on critical thinking and questioning authority when necessary. Her deputy during these years was Neville Longbottom, who had returned to Hogwarts as herbology professor after a brief stint as an Auror. Minerva had handpicked him for both positions, seeing in him the same dedication to education and protection of students that she valued. Neville had grown into a confident, capable wizard who commanded respect from both students and staff. Minerva knew that when she eventually retired, Hogwarts would be in excellent hands with Neville, ready to step into leadership. As the years passed and Minerva grew older, she began to think about her legacy and what she would leave behind. She had dedicated over a century to Hogwarts, first as a student, then as a professor, and finally as headmistress. She had taught thousands of students, had shaped the magical education of multiple generations. She had fought in 2 wars against dark wizards who threatened everything she valued. She had helped rebuild the wizarding world after its darkest periods. But her greatest pride was always in her students, the young people who had passed through her classroom and gone on to do remarkable things. The ones who became healers and professors and aurors and ministry officials and shop owners and parents, all contributing to a wizarding society that was slowly becoming more just and more equal. Every time a former student sent her a letter telling her about their life, every time she saw one of them making a positive difference in the world, she felt that her life's work had meaning. She thought often about the people she had lost over her long life. Her mother, Isabel, and father, Robert. Her brothers, Malcolm and Robert Jr., who had lived Muggle lives and died many decades earlier. Dougal McGregor, her first love, whom she had given up for magic and career. Her students who had died too young, James and Lily and Cedric and Fred and Colin and so many others. Her colleagues and friends, Dumbledore and Moody and Tonks and Lupin. The list grew longer every year, a catalogue of people she had cared about and who were now gone. But she also thought about those who remained. Harry Potter, who visited Hogwarts regularly and brought his children to meet the headmistress who had taught their grandparents. Ron and Hermione, who had married and built a life together. Neville, who had become the man she always knew he could be. George Weasley, who had turned his grief over losing Fred into creating joy for others through his joke shop. All the students and colleagues and friends who had survived the wars and were building better lives in the peace they had fought so hard to achieve. Minerva never married, never had children of her own. She had chosen her career over romance back when she ended things with Dougal, and she had never found another person who could understand both the magical and non-magical parts of her identity. But she had never felt that her life was incomplete because of this choice. Hogwarts had been her family, her students had been her children, her colleagues had been her companions through decades of joy and sorrow and everything in between. As her time as headmistress drew toward its inevitable conclusion, Minerva began preparing for retirement. She was well over 150 years old, had lived longer than most witches and wizards ever did. She was still sharp mentally, still capable magically, but she was tired. Tired of carrying responsibility for hundreds of students. Tired of the administrative burdens of running a school. Tired of always being on duty, always needing to be the strong one, the reliable one, the one who held everything together. She announced her retirement date a year in advance, giving the Board of Governors time to make arrangements and allowing her time to train her successor properly. Neville Longbottom was officially appointed as the next headmaster, a choice that met with universal approval from staff, students, and the wider wizarding community. Minerva spent her final year as headmistress, making sure Neville understood every aspect of the job, introducing him to all the secrets and traditions of Hogwarts leadership, preparing him for the challenges and rewards that came with being responsible for the most important educational institution in the high British magical world. Her final graduation ceremony as headmistress was emotional for everyone involved. Former students returned to Hogwarts to honour her, including Harry Potter, who gave a speech about what Professor McGonagall had meant to him and to countless others. He spoke about her fairness and her high standards, about how she had pushed students to be better than they thought they could be, about her courage in standing up to dark wizards and corrupt authority. He spoke about how she had protected students even at great personal cost, how she had maintained Hogwarts as a sanctuary even when darkness threatened to overwhelm the wizarding world. When it was Minerva's turn to speak, she looked out at the assembled students and guests and felt a profound sense of gratitude. She talked about the privilege it had been to serve Hogwarts for so many decades, to watch students discover their magical abilities and grow into capable adults. She talked about the importance of education, not just in learning spells and brewing potions, but in learning values and character and how to make difficult choices. She talked about courage not being the absence of fear, but the decision to act rightly despite fear. She reminded the graduating class that they were inheriting a wizarding world that had been rebuilt on the ashes of war, a world that had the opportunity to be better than what came before. She challenged them to fight against prejudice and injustice, to stand up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves, to remember that their choices defined them far more than their abilities or their bloodlines. She told them that Hogwarts would always be their home, that they could return whenever they needed guidance or support, or simply a reminder of where they came from. The standing ovation lasted several minutes. Students and staff and guests all rose to honour the witch who had given so much to Hogwarts and to the wizarding world. Minerva accepted their applause with dignity and grace, though her eyes were suspiciously bright. When the ceremony finally ended and people began to leave, many stopped to say personal goodbyes, to tell her what she had meant to them, to thank her for everything she had done. Minerva McGonagall retired to a small cottage in the Scottish Highlands, not far from where she had been born over a century and a half earlier. She filled her days with reading and research, with correspondence with former students and colleagues, with occasional visits to Hogwarts, where she could walk the familiar corridors and see how the school continued to thrive under Neville's leadership. She published several papers on advanced transfiguration theory, sharing knowledge she had accumulated over decades of study and practice. She lived to see Harry's children attend Hogwarts, watched another generation of Potters and Weasleys sorted into Gryffindor House. She attended the weddings of former students, held their babies, listened to their stories about the lives they had built. She watched the wizarding world continue to change and evolve, slowly becoming more inclusive and more just, though still imperfect and still with work to do. When Minerva McGonagall finally passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 177, the entire wizarding world mourned. The Daily Prophet dedicated its entire front page to her life and legacy. The Ministry of Magic held a memorial service that was attended by hundreds of people whose lives she had touched. Hogwarts flew its flags at half-mast, and students held a vigil in the Great Hall, lighting candles and sharing memories of the legendary professor and headmistress. She was buried in a small cemetery in Caithness, not far from where her parents had been laid to rest over a century before. The headstone was simple, listing her name, her dates of birth and death, and the words, dedicated teacher, loyal friend, brave defender of all that is good. But her true memorial was in the thousands of lives she had influenced, the students she had taught and protected and inspired to be better than they otherwise would have been. At Hogwarts, a portrait of Minerva McGonagall was hung in the headmaster's office, alongside those of all the previous headmasters and headmistresses. The portrait showed her seated at her desk, wearing her characteristic tartan robes and pointed hat, looking stern but with a hint of warmth in her eyes. From that portrait, she could continue to offer advice to future heads of Hogwarts, could watch over the school she had loved and served for so many years, could ensure that her values and her vision for magical education would endure long after her physical body had returned to dust. In the years and decades that followed, Minerva McGonagall became something of a legend. Stories about her strictness and her fairness, her courage and her dedication, passed into Hogwarts lore. First-year students were told about how she had once transformed into a cat to catch students breaking curfew, about how she had dueled Death Eaters to protect the school, about her impossibly high standards in Transfiguration class that had somehow made everyone better witches and wizards. Some of these stories were exaggerated or embellished, but the core truth remained. She had been extraordinary in every sense of the word. Her influence on magical education extended far beyond Hogwarts. The textbooks she had written on transfiguration theory became standard references throughout the wizarding world. Her teaching methods were studied and emulated by professors at other magical schools. Her approach to student discipline, strict but fair and always focused on helping students become better people, rather than simply punishing wrongdoing, became a model for how education should be conducted. But perhaps her greatest legacy was simpler and more personal. Every witch or wizard who had been lucky enough to be taught by Professor McGonagall carried something of her with them. They remembered her expectations, her belief that they were capable of more than they thought possible. They remembered her fairness, how she never played favorites or let status determine how students were treated. They remembered her courage, how she had stood against darkness even when it would have been easier and safer to compromise or look away. And when those former students faced difficult choices in their own lives, when they were tempted to take the easy path instead of the right one, when they wondered if they were brave enough or strong enough to do what needed doing, they would think of Professor McGonagall. They would imagine her stern face and her piercing gaze, would hear her voice reminding them that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it. And often, that memory would be enough to help them find the strength they needed. Minerva McGonagall had lived an extraordinary life spanning nearly 2 centuries. She had been born in a time when the wizarding world was very different, when Grindelwald had not yet risen to power, when the conflicts and changes of the 20th century were still far in the future. She had witnessed and participated in some of the most important events in modern magical history. She had known and worked with some of the greatest witches and wizards of multiple generations. But at her core, she had always been a teacher. Someone who believed that education mattered, that young people deserved to be challenged and supported and prepared for the world they would inherit. Someone who understood that teaching magic was important, but teaching values and character was essential. Someone who dedicated her entire adult life to making sure that Hogwarts remained a place where students could learn and grow and become the best versions of themselves. She had made sacrifices for her calling. She had given up romantic love and family life. She had put herself in danger multiple times to protect students and the school. She had lived through wars and losses and heartbreaks that would have broken lesser people. But she had never wavered in her commitment to Hogwarts and to the values she believed in. Courage, fairness, hard work, dedication, the importance of doing what was right, even when it was difficult. These were the principles that guided her throughout her long life, and they were the principles she instilled in generations of students. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, think about Minerva McGonagall's incredible journey. Think about the young girl from Scotland who discovered she was a witch and went off to Hogwarts for the first time, nervous and excited in equal measure. Think about the brilliant student who excelled in every subject, who became an Animagus through sheer determination and skill. Think about the young woman who chose magic over love, who walked away from an easy, comfortable life because she knew she was meant for something more. Think about the ministry worker who became disillusioned with bureaucracy and prejudice, who realized that real change happened through education rather than politics. Think about the professor who stood at the front of her classroom year after year, demanding excellence from her students because she knew they were capable of it, who never accepted mediocrity when greatness was achievable, who pushed and challenged and sometimes frustrated her students, but who always cared about their success and their well-being, who remembered them years and decades after they left her classroom, who followed their careers and their lives with pride and affection. Think about the head of Gryffindor, who embodied everything her house stood for. Courage, yes, but also loyalty and dedication, and an unwavering commitment to doing what was right. Who protected her students fiercely, who stood between them and danger again and again, who would have given her life without hesitation if it meant keeping them safe, who built Gryffindor House into a family, a community where students learned not just magic, but also values and character. Think about the deputy headmistress who helped run Hogwarts for decades, who managed the enormous complexity of scheduling and discipline and administration with efficiency and fairness, who served as Dumbledore's right hand, his most trusted colleague and advisor, the one he turned to when he needed counsel or support, who stepped into leadership during the darkest times, when Umbridge took over the school and when Death Eaters controlled Hogwarts, and who never compromised her principles, even when compromise would have been safer. Think about the warrior who fought in 2 wizarding wars, who joined the Order of the Phoenix not once but twice, who dueled Death Eaters and protected the innocent, and stood against darkness with every weapon at her disposal, who was struck by 4 stunners simultaneously, and survived through sheer magical strength and will to live, who brought the suits of armor and statues of Hogwarts to life, to defend the castle during the Battle of Hogwarts, creating an army to fight beside the human defenders. Think about the headmistress who rebuilt Hogwarts after the war, both physically and spiritually, who created a safe place for traumatized students to heal and learn, who made sure that the lessons of the past weren't forgotten, that future generations would understand the cost of fighting tyranny and the importance of standing up against injustice, who led the school through its transition from darkness back into light, who helped create a better wizarding world from the ashes of the old one. Think about the elderly witch who retired to a cottage in Scotland, who lived to see the children and grandchildren of her former students attend Hogwarts and carry on the traditions and values she had worked so hard to instill, who watched the wizarding world continue to improve and evolve, knowing that she had played a part in making that possible, who died peacefully at an advanced age, surrounded by the love and respect of everyone whose life she had touched. Minerva McGonagall's life teaches us many lessons. That intelligence and magical ability are gifts, but what you do with those gifts is what truly matters. That sometimes the right choice is the difficult one. That giving up what you want for what you believe in takes courage, but is often necessary. That teaching is one of the noblest professions. That shaping young minds and preparing the next generation to be better than the current one is work of profound importance. Her life teaches us that fairness doesn't mean treating everyone the same, but treating everyone according to what they need and what they've earned. That high standards and strict discipline can coexist with genuine caring and support. That authority should be used to protect and guide, never to control or harm. That the rules exist for good reasons, but that sometimes, rarely, breaking the rules is the right thing to do if it serves a higher purpose. She showed us that courage isn't about being fearless. Minerva McGonagall felt fear many times in her long life. She was afraid when she chose to end her relationship with Dougal, uncertain if she was making the right choice. She was afraid during the wars, watching students and colleagues die, wondering if the good side would prevail. She was afraid when she challenged Umbridge, and when she fought Death Eaters, and when she took responsibility for rebuilding Hogwarts after Dumbledore's death. But she acted anyway. She made the hard choices despite her fear. She stood up to tyrants and dark wizards, despite knowing she could be killed. She took on responsibilities that would have crushed others, despite her doubts about whether she could succeed. That's what real courage looks like. Not the absence of fear, but the decision to do what needs doing, regardless of fear. The choice to be brave even when being brave is terrifying. Minerva McGonagall also teaches us about the power of dedication and consistency. She didn't achieve greatness through one dramatic act or one moment of brilliance. She achieved it through decades of showing up, day after day, year after year, doing her job with excellence and integrity, teaching her classes with the same high standards, whether it was her first year as a professor or her 50th, protecting her students with the same fierce devotion, whether they were the children of famous heroes or the children of ordinary wizarding families. There's something almost radical about that kind of steady, consistent dedication in a world that often celebrates flash over substance, that values quick success over long-term commitment. Minerva McGonagall reminds us that the unglamorous work of showing up every day, of doing your job well even when no one is watching, of maintaining your standards even when it would be easier to lower them is what truly changes the world. Teachers who inspire thousands of students over the course of a career. Mentors who guide young people toward becoming better versions of themselves. Leaders who create institutions and systems that outlast them and continue doing good long after they're gone. She also embodied a particular kind of strength that our world needs more of. Not the strength of physical power or magical might, though she had plenty of both, but the strength of moral clarity, of knowing right from wrong and standing firm in that knowledge. The strength to say no when everyone around you is saying yes. The strength to stand alone if necessary. To be unpopular if being popular means compromising your values. How many times in her life did Minerva McGonagall stand against the crowd? She opposed Umbridge when many staff members tried to appease her, or simply stayed out of the way. She protected students from the Carrows when collaboration would have been safer. She argued against leaving Harry on the Dursleys' doorstep when Dumbledore had made his decision. She challenged Snape in front of the entire school when everyone believed he was headmaster by right. She spent her entire career holding students to standards that many thought were too strict, refusing to lower her expectations even when students and parents complained. That kind of strength, the strength to stand by your principles even when standing alone, is increasingly rare. It's easier to go along, to compromise, to tell yourself that you're being realistic or practical, or that one person can't make a difference anyway. Minerva McGonagall's life is a reminder that one person absolutely can make a difference, that holding firm to your values, even when it's difficult, is exactly what allows good people to change the world for the better. Her story also reminds us about the complexity of choices and the importance of understanding that good people can disagree about what's right. Minerva didn't always agree with Dumbledore, even though she trusted and respected him deeply. She questioned his decisions, argued with him, sometimes did things differently than he would have preferred, but she also recognized his wisdom and his good intentions, even when his methods seemed questionable. This is a mature kind of moral thinking that acknowledges that ethical questions often don't have clear right answers, that reasonable people can look at the same situation and come to different conclusions about what should be done. It's the kind of thinking that allows for disagreement without demonization, that can hold both respect for authority and willingness to question it, that understands that loyalty doesn't mean blind obedience. Think about how Minerva handled the Dumbledore's army situation. The group was technically breaking Umbridge's rules, and as deputy headmistress, Minerva had a duty to enforce those rules. But she also understood that the rules were unjust, that students needed to learn defensive magic, that Umbridge's authority was being used to harm rather than protect students. So she walked a careful line, neither explicitly endorsing the group nor working too hard to shut it down. She found a way to maintain her position and her principles simultaneously, even when those seemed to be in conflict. That kind of moral nuance, the ability to navigate complex situations where there are no perfect choices, is a skill we all need. Life rarely presents us with simple decisions between obvious good and obvious evil. More often, we face choices between competing goods or between different kinds of harm. We have to weigh duties and values that sometimes pull in different directions. We have to figure out how to be true to our principles while also being practical about what we can actually accomplish. Minerva McGonagall managed this balancing act throughout her life. She was principled without being rigid, firm without being cruel, demanding without being unreasonable. She held high standards, but understood that different people had different abilities and limitations. She enforced rules, but also recognized when rules needed to be bent or broken for good reasons. She was strong and independent, but also knew when to defer to others' judgment and expertise. Her relationship with Dumbledore exemplified this balance. She was his deputy for decades, supporting his leadership and helping implement his vision for Hogwarts. But she also challenged him when she disagreed, questioned his decisions when she had concerns, maintained her own independent judgment while still working within his authority. She was both loyal, subordinate, and equal colleague, both supporter and critic, both follower and leader in her own right. This kind of relationship, where two strong personalities work together while maintaining their individual integrity, is difficult to achieve, but incredibly powerful when it happens. It requires mutual respect, genuine trust, willingness to hear criticism, and confidence that disagreement doesn't mean disloyalty. That Minerva and Dumbledore maintained this partnership for so many decades, through so many crises and challenges, speaks to both of their characters and their commitment to something larger than either of them individually. We should also think about Minerva McGonagall's relationship with time and change. She lived through nearly 2 centuries, watching the wizarding world transform multiple times. She was born in the 1830s when the magical world was very different from what it would become. She lived through Grindelwald's rise and fall, through decades of relative peace, through Voldemort's first rise and defeat, through more peaceful years, and through Voldemort's return and final defeat. She saw fashions and technologies and social attitudes change dramatically over her lifetime. Throughout all this change, Minerva maintained certain core values while also adapting to new circumstances. She never compromised on the importance of excellence in education, on fairness in treatment of students, on courage in the face of evil. But she also evolved in her understanding, became more flexible in some ways, learned from experience and from changing times. She wasn't the same person at 170 as she had been at 30 or at 80. She grew and changed while remaining fundamentally herself. This is a subtle but important lesson. In a world that changes constantly, we need people who can hold on to enduring truths while also remaining open to new understanding. We need people who aren't so rigid that they can't adapt when adaptation is necessary, but also aren't so flexible that they have no firm foundation. Minerva McGonagall showed us what that looks like. How to be both constant and changing, both traditional and innovative, both rooted in the past and oriented toward the future. Her teaching career spanned generations, and each generation of students thought their experience with Professor McGonagall was unique to them. The students in the 1860s thought she was particularly strict with them. The students in the 1920s remembered her as the professor who pushed them hardest. The students in the 1970s, the marauders and their classmates, knew her as the no-nonsense head of Gryffindor, who seemed to catch them breaking rules with uncanny regularity. Harry's generation, the students of the 1990s, experienced her as both strict professor and protective guardian during dangerous times. But really, Minerva McGonagall was remarkably consistent across all those decades. She had the same high standards, the same commitment to fairness, the same dedication to her students' well-being. What changed wasn't her fundamental approach, but the context in which she taught. Peacetime versus wartime. Younger students versus older students. Different personalities and different challenges. She adapted her methods to the circumstances while maintaining her core principles. This consistency was itself a kind of gift to her students. In a changing and often chaotic world, Professor McGonagall was a constant. You knew what to expect from her. You knew that rules would be enforced fairly, that hard work would be recognized and rewarded, that excellence would be demanded, but that support would be available for those who tried their best. There was comfort in that predictability, safety in knowing that someone would hold the line, maintain the standards, ensure that certain values would never be compromised. Think about what it meant to students during Voldemort's reign, to know that Professor McGonagall was still at Hogwarts, still fighting for what was right, even under Death Eater control. Her presence was a form of resistance itself, a reminder that not everyone had bowed to darkness, that there were still adults who could be trusted to protect students as much as possible. The fact that she had been there for decades, that she represented continuity with Hogwarts' better past, made her a symbol of hope even in the darkest times. We should also reflect on Minerva McGonagall's Animagus form and what it represented. That she was a cat is significant. Cats are independent creatures, not easily controlled or dominated. They're observant, noticing things others miss. They're graceful and precise in their movements. They can be aloof and dignified, but also affectionate on their own terms. They're predators despite their small size, capable of surprising ferocity when threatened or when protecting what matters to them. All of these characteristics applied to Minerva McGonagall in her human form as well. She was fiercely independent, following her own judgment rather than simply accepting what others told her. She was incredibly observant, noticing when students were troubled or when something was wrong in the castle. She moved through the world with grace and precision, whether performing complex transfiguration or navigating school politics. She maintained dignity and professional distance with most people, but showed real affection to those she cared about, and she could be absolutely ferocious when her students or her school were threatened. The Animagus transformation is supposed to reflect a person's inner nature, the animal that matches who they truly are. That Minerva became a cat rather than something larger or more obviously powerful tells us something important about her. Power doesn't have to be loud or flashy. Strength doesn't require size or obvious displays. Sometimes the most formidable people are those who carry their power quietly, who don't need to prove themselves because they're secure in who they are and what they're capable of. Her distinctive markings, the square patterns around her eyes that resembled her glasses, were uniquely hers. No other Animagus would have exactly those markings. They were a signature, a way to identify her even in cat form. This suggests that while the Animagus transformation changes your physical form, your essential self remains recognizable to those who know you well. Minerva McGonagall was always Minerva McGonagall, whether human or cat, whether young or old, whether in peacetime or war. The registry requirement for Animagi exists because the ability to transform into an animal is powerful and potentially dangerous if used for criminal purposes. That Minerva registered immediately, following the law, even though she could have remained unregistered like the Marauders did, tells us about her fundamental respect for rules and institutions, even when she disagreed with specific policies. She believed in working within systems to change them, rather than simply ignoring laws she found inconvenient. This wasn't weakness or excessive compliance. It was a strategic choice based on understanding how societies function and how lasting change happens. You can't reform institutions from outside if you've made yourself an outlaw. You can't argue for better policies if you're not participating in the legitimate processes. Minerva understood this in a way that many revolutionaries and rebels don't. She knew that the most effective resistance to injustice often comes from people who maintain their positions within systems while working to transform those systems from within. As we think about Minerva McGonagall's life and legacy, we should remember that she was, in the end, a teacher. That was her primary identity, the role she chose and maintained through nearly everything else. She could have been Minister for Magic if she wanted. She had the skills, the reputation, the respect of the wizarding community, but she chose teaching instead, recognizing that education was where she could make the most difference. This choice reflects a deep understanding of how societies change and improve. Politicians and leaders come and go, each leaving their mark for a few years before being replaced. But teachers shape entire generations. A good teacher influences hundreds or thousands of students over a career, and those students go on to influence others, creating ripples that spread through society for decades. The values and skills and ways of thinking that teachers instill in their students become the foundation for the kind of society those students will create. Minerva McGonagall taught thousands of students over her century-long teaching career. Each of those students learned more than just Transfiguration from her. They learned about discipline and dedication. They learned that excellence is achieved through hard work, not natural talent alone. They learned that fairness means holding everyone to the same standards while recognizing individual circumstances. They learned that courage means standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult or dangerous. Those lessons spread through the wizarding world as her students graduated and built their lives. Ministry officials who had been taught by Professor McGonagall approached their work with integrity and fairness. Healers who had learned from her treated all patients with equal care, regardless of blood status or wealth. Parents who remembered her classes raised their children to value education and hard work. Teachers who had been her students tried to emulate her dedication and high standards in their own classrooms. This is how one person changes the world, not through one grand gesture or one moment of heroism, though Minerva had plenty of heroic moments, but through consistent, dedicated work over decades, influencing people who go on to influence others, creating a cascade of positive impact that spreads far beyond what any single person could accomplish alone. It's a slower kind of revolution than the dramatic upheavals that make history books, but it's ultimately more lasting and more profound. Think about the specific students whose lives Minerva McGonagall changed. Harry Potter, who arrived at Hogwarts damaged by years of neglect and found in Professor McGonagall someone who believed in him and pushed him to be his best self. Hermione Granger, who saw in her Transfiguration professor a model of what a brilliant witch could be, proof that intelligence and dedication were valuable and would be recognized. Neville Longbottom, who grew from an uncertain, clumsy boy into a confident leader, partly because Professor McGonagall never gave up on him, never treated him as hopeless even when he struggled in her class. And those are just the famous students, the ones whose stories we know. Think about all the others. The quiet students who worked hard and earned outstanding grades and went on to successful but unremarkable careers. The struggling students who barely passed Transfiguration but learned valuable lessons about perseverance and dealing with failure. The troublemakers who needed someone to see past their behavior to the potential underneath. The scared students during the wars who needed to see an adult standing firm against darkness. Each of those students carried something of Minerva McGonagall with them after they left Hogwarts. A memory of her standing at the front of the classroom, wand in hand, demonstrating a complex transformation with perfect precision. A memory of her stern face softening slightly when a student finally mastered a difficult spell. a memory of her voice cutting through chaos, organizing defenders during the Battle of Hogwarts, never showing the fear she must have felt, a memory of her absolute conviction that doing the right thing mattered more than doing the easy thing. These memories became part of who those students were, influenced the choices they made, shaped the kind of adults they became. And when they had children and grandchildren, they told stories about Professor McGonagall, passing her lessons on to new generations. She became part of Hogwarts mythology, one of the legendary professors whose influence extended far beyond the years they actually taught. So as we come to the end of our journey through Minerva McGonagall's remarkable life, let's remember the full scope of what she represented. A brilliant witch who mastered some of the most difficult magic known to the wizarding world. A dedicated teacher who shaped the education and character of thousands of students. A courageous fighter who stood against dark wizards in 2 wars and never wavered in her commitment to protecting the innocent. A fair but demanding leader who rebuilt Hogwarts after its darkest period and ensured it would continue as a beacon of learning and safety. But beyond all these impressive accomplishments, Minerva McGonagall was simply someone who showed up day after day, year after year, decade after decade, and did her job with excellence and integrity. She didn't always make the right choices. She had regrets and mistakes and moments she wished she could do differently. She was human, flawed and complex, and sometimes uncertain. But she never stopped trying to do better, never stopped holding herself to the same high standards she held her students to, never stopped believing that education and courage and fairness mattered. In a world that often feels chaotic and uncertain, where it's easy to become cynical or to decide that individual actions don't matter, Minerva McGonagall's life is a reminder that they do matter, that showing up matters, that maintaining your standards matters, that treating people fairly matters, that standing up against injustice matters, that teaching the next generation matters, that being consistent and reliable and dedicated matters. Her legacy lives on in the countless lives she touched, in the institution she served and protected, in the values she upheld and taught to others. Every time a former student makes a difficult choice because they remember what Professor McGonagall would have expected of them, her influence continues. Every time a teacher pushes a student to achieve more than they thought possible, Minerva McGonagall's approach to education lives on. Every time someone stands up to injustice despite fear, they embody the courage she demonstrated throughout her life. Sleep well tonight, and remember that you too can make a difference in the world, not through grand gestures necessarily, but through consistent dedication to doing good work, treating people fairly and standing up for what's right. The example of Minerva McGonagall shows us that a life well lived, a career dedicated to service, and a commitment to excellence and integrity can create ripples that spread through the world long after we're gone. Thank you for joining me on Sleep 2 Cinema for this deep exploration of one of the wizarding world's most remarkable witches. If you enjoyed this journey through Professor McGonagall's life and legacy, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more deep dives into your favorite cinematic universes. Until next time, may you dream of moving staircases, enchanted ceilings, and the halls of Hogwarts where generations of witches and wizards learned not just magic, but courage, fairness, and the importance of doing what's right. Sweet dreams.